Welcome back to the channel. This is Trendy Storm and you are watching first part of What If Naruto Was Sent to Fairy Tale World by Madara. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe to this channel. Not wasting no time, let's start the story.
Naruto exclaimed, "Kurama," as the blonde's body was pushed free of the nine-tailed beast. The blonde instantly felt the drain from the loss of the Biju in his stomach as he recoiled and started to fall from a height of 50 meters. Without their Biju, a Jinchuriki will perish. This cannot be how it ends. At what point did I give up? Never will I give in. I'm not the Hokage. Because I choose to fight back, I will never give up. I am the one that everyone is depending on. Naruto gritted his teeth and roared to himself. Only with the greatest of willpower was Naruto able to move on his own, and he barely managed to right himself in midair. As fast as his failing body would allow, the blonde reached into his back pouch and took out a kunai and an intricately designed seal tag. Naruto hurled the projectile at the retreating chakra body of the Kyuubi, barely able to wrap the seal around the kunai at a painfully slow speed before he hit the ground. His mind was shutting down, his physical state was at its lowest, and this was all he could do. If he didn't succeed, that was it. Right now, there was nothing he could do but hope. I won't let you leave. With that troublesome child out of the way, Madara's plans should now go forward without a hitch as he gazed impassively at the fallen blonde and his approaching kunai. Though he was aware that Naruto was a skilled seal user, he was positive that the weak child could do nothing now that the Kyuubi's chakra construct and all of the tailed beasts were restrained. As his kunai drew nearer to his partner, Naruto could only gaze. The pace of time slowed. The Kyuubi might have a chance to prevail and live if the kunai arrived in time. But if the kunai failed to make it to his Biju's chakra construct in time, he would undoubtedly perish and the Moon Eye Plan would take control of the entire Shinobi Alliance. Make it, please. Naruto let out an inward scream, unable to even move his mouth at this point. A burst of light engulfed and spread across the entire battlefield just before Madara brought all of the chained-tailed beasts to himself. Even though they were miles away from the main battle, every shinobi in the Alliance force lifted their arms to protect their eyes from the dazzling light. Madara Uchiha did not bat an eyelash as he gazed impassively at the light. The scene in front of the legendary shinobi caused him to widen his eyes a little in shock after the light had gone out, but he controlled the emotion and maintained the renowned stoic Uchiha expression. Madara, on the other hand, was having a mental breakdown and was unable to comprehend how the blonde had managed to survive. Once again, a Haori with lines and tattoos surrounded the blonde, who was standing tall and proud, the last remnants of orange chakra fading into his stomach. His blue eyes, which had been on the verge of closing due to death, were now wide open with resolve. His cross-shaped orange eyes focused on his last opponent, gazing down at him from his lofty summon. The deep voice in his head said, "Nice job, Naruto. But what did you do?" And Naruto exhaled in relief. The blonde was a little uneasy that the legendary shinobi had not yet moved, but he would wait to get ready. "I threw a seal that attached to you which would immediately seal yourself back into me. It's an aberration of my Samshiraishin, flying thunder god. Without technical terms, I can move the things that my seal touches near my own body, but in this case, I just redirected you back into my body. Because the seal was previously broken, however, there is no seal blocking you now." Naruto said with a slight smirk that the cage had been cracked. He knew Kurama would support him and fight the cursed Uchiha, so he wasn't particularly bothered. Afterward was the question. Kyuubi instantly burst out laughing, and was that sadism? The tall, metal bars that had kept him from leaving for decades were in front of the strongest of the tailed beasts as he walked. Kurama pushed it experimentally and was happy with the outcome. It opened. "I may not be the same level as my 2.san or my Ka-chan when it comes to seals, but with this development, we can completely merge and perform a true Biju mode." Kurama laughed with a new level of insane joy and cackled in ecstasy. At last, he had the opportunity to escape his damned cage and obliterate everything that stood in his way. He didn't hesitate to accept it. He had years' worth of stored energy inside of him, and now it was time to release it with a massive chakra explosion when he gave it his all. "Naruto, I'm warning you right now. This will be extremely dangerous. We will be merging our chakras for the short time we go into our complete transformation but..." With his voice echoing in his mindscape, Naruto interrupted Kurama, saying, "Shut up and do it already, you damned fox. You know nothing is going to stop me now. Not you or even my parents, so let's get this damn show on the road, Ibeo. That bastard is going down." Kurama just laughed, anticipating that response from his container. "You don't disappoint, Naruto." Then, together, the two roared, "Let's get wild. Let's do this, Ibeo." When Madara noticed that the blonde's chakra levels were rising to extraordinary levels, He abruptly assumed a battle stance while still watching passively. It swiftly reached his Biju Sage mode's peak, but rather than slowing down or stopping at the top of his chakra level, the blonde's chakra kept exploding, getting bigger and bigger until it now surpassed the combined chakra levels of Madara and Hashirama at their prime. When the chakra growth eventually slowed, its density had increased to the point where it was actually pressing down on the renowned shinobi, causing the ground beneath the blonde to split and crack under the extreme pressure. "Here I come." The blonde growled in a tone that was a little demonic. It sounded as though he and the Kyuubi were speaking together because their voices had merged. The ground exploded beneath Naruto's feet as he bounded forward. A Rasengan was already fully developed in Naruto's right hand when he suddenly materialized in front of Madara in an orange flash. The blonde's crazy speed and movement would have been invisible to anyone else, but Madara was anything but normal. He possessed the Rinnegan and the highest echelon of the Sharingan. Madara quickly returned fire with a lightning fast punch that sent Naruto flying back after dodging the approaching Rasengan. But when Naruto took the solid hit, it dispersed in a cloud of smoke, exposing itself as a clone. He created a clone when, with my Rinnegan, I was unable to even notice. Despite having technique and experience under his belt, Madara realized that he would now need to exercise caution. In this instance, it might just save his life because the blonde was much more powerful than she had been moments before. But there was no relief for the black-haired shinobi. Already, a fully developed Rasen Shuriken was homing from behind him. A slight sense of disappointment struck the targeted shinboy. Victory wouldn't be too tough because the blonde was still behaving so predictably. Here, he believed he would face a challenge that was on par with or better than Hashirama. Madara only had to move his hand in the direction of the lethal Kinjutsu to start absorbing it. The lethal assault, however, abruptly vanished into smoke, exposing a smirking clone who had another Rasen Shuriken ready. Madara's eyes widened in shock, and he instantly raised both hands in a pose that Naruto was all too familiar with. Shinra Tensai. The clone exclaimed as it flew backward and vanished in a smoke cloud. Madara had no other option to stop that attack from reaching him. It was absurd how fast the clone was moving toward him, faster than the Raikage with his lightning armor on. The legendary shinobi had very little chance of surviving if the attack had been successful. The fact that his chakra points would have been destroyed only made his chances of dying even higher. But once more, before Madara could think about his predicament, a second Biju mode clone materialized behind him, his body glowing an even brighter orange. As two chakra arms revolved around the spinning sphere, the Rasengan in his hands started to turn somewhat purple, eventually forming a Biju Rasen Shuriken. Attack the slim chance of survival. Anyone struck by that power would undoubtedly perish. Madara was able to see how much chakra was used in the ability and how lethal the technique was with his Rinnegan. Kami, for his part, could sense the absurd amount of chakra used in the ability even without his eyes. He would never allow himself to be struck by that method. Naruto threw the enormous spiraling sphere and yelled, "Your 5 seconds aren't up yet, so take this, instead." This must be the last one. After making an internal decision, Naruto's eyes widened in shock. Once more, Madara simply sucked in the chakra, intensive ability by moving his hands in front of him. What the hell? His eyes are so absurd. He ought to be limited in how much he can take in, the blonde grumbled. In all seriousness, the Rinnegan was foolishly overwhelmed. But rather than being disappointed, Naruto's frown gradually turned into a smirk, his feral features growing even more menacing and animalistic. He said, "Caught you," and then he dispelled. Madara heard this just prior to being hit by a Rasen Shuriken that emerged from beneath the earth. He stopped absorbing the Biju Rasen Shuriken from the abrupt impact as soon as he was struck by the Rasen Shuriken. Then the Biju Rasen Shuriken shot forward again, and hit true this time. For miles around, the earth was rocked by a massive explosion that caused splits and cracks in the ground, with some regions separating into fissures. What happened? What's going on? Many of the Shinobi Alliance's surviving ninjas were perplexed and concerned about the consequences. What was in store for them if Madara possessed that kind of potential, which they knew he possessed because he could cause meteors to fall out of the sky? But all of the ninjas and cages were relieved and excited by Hinata's next words. "The lavender-eyed Hyuga exclaimed. It was Naruto, loud enough for the other ninjas to hear. With the battle potentially coming to an end, the ninjas started to cheer. Naruto's view was obscured by a thick cloud of dust back on the battlefield. That minor detail, however, did not stop the Jinchuriki from making clones and hurling hundreds of kunais with explosive tags that were specially made. The earth was rocked by another powerful explosion, but it was not nearly as destructive as the Biju Rasen Shuriken. Naruto waited, gazing intently into the dust clouds to see what had happened to the Uchiha, after he had thrown all but a handful of his weapons. Naruto gave himself a brief moment to consider Sasuke, the other Uchiha. I sense Sasuke's energy coming back. Well, he's still alive. When Naruto's time ran out, his Sage mode vanished. It was quickly replaced by extreme fatigue, but Naruto's Biju mode persisted and didn't appear to be going away anytime soon. Naruto smirked and crossed his arms in response, saying, "We can only hold on to this transformation for about another minute now that your Sage mode ran out, Naruto. What will you do?" "Don't tell me you didn't see it, you almighty fox," Naruto teased, grinning broadly as his orange eyes focused on the area where he sensed all the bad feelings. The nine-tailed fox snorted back, but he was secretly intrigued. What did Naruto do that even the powerful demon, himself, was blind to? Madara was standing when the dust and smoke had subsided, though she was clearly having some trouble. As his flawless Susanoo materialized above him, towering hundreds of feet above the blonde, the man refused to give in to the agonizing pain and instead started to yell with effort. Still grinning, Naruto simply shook his head. "You lose." Fuin, seal. Madara's last line of defense abruptly vanished. The final adversary experienced the sensation of losing chakra and his body vanishing into a different realm after using Kamui on himself. When he realized he was powerless to stop the teleportation, he glared up at the blonde. Even Naruto could see the cracks beginning to show, despite his cold tone when he asked, "What have you done?" Now that his ambitious plans appeared to be coming to an end, the shinobi in front of him was going crazy with rage. When Naruto unlocked his Biju mode, his once bright orange eyes became icy, lifeless blue. The strain of using the finished Biju mode hit him instantly, but he managed to hide the pain and tension behind his calm expression. He gazed down at the sleeping form of the fabled shinobi as he fixed his gaze on Madara. "I'm only paying you back with interest. You have killed my friends and my family. And so, I have decided that your punishment would be to be sealed in my creation. A pocket dimension where you can't use your own teleportation techniques because your chakra would have already been sealed away, never to be in your grasp again." At this point, Naruto's calm expression shifted to one filled with sarcasm and rage. "Perfect, isn't it? The very cursed eye that could help people to teleport cannot be used in my realm. Humiliation for such a legendary shinobi is fitting for someone like you. You won't be able to use the Rinnegan because you have no ability to use chakra anymore. You won't be able to kill anyone anymore. In fact, you only have another 20 seconds until all of your chakra disappears, becoming latent in your body until the day you die in my dimension. You, Madara Uchiha, have failed." Slightly weary after his brief remarks, Naruto for a moment to catch his breath. Naruto mentally coughed and told Kurama to stop talking. "You were saying that you weren't a seal master? And it's good to know you're taking that sadist nature from me." "I see. I don't need to know when you did it, but this will be my final action then before I leave this world forever," Madara said, grunting as he took his place on the ground. He already knew that fighting a seal that had been placed against him would be pointless. Suddenly, Naruto sensed the weak shinobi's chakra rising to extreme levels. Naruto thought, bewildered, he's going to kill himself if he uses chakra to that level when he's that low. Kurama, in contrast to his container, already understood what the madman was doing. Kurama yelled at Naruto to move aside. Naruto attempted to reply, but it was too late. The Uchiha's final jutsu was already consuming his body. Madara closed his eyes as he watched the blonde's body slowly swirl into a portal he had made. Like Madara, Naruto was too exhausted to move freely and knew that fighting back this time would be pointless. Even he wasn't that dumb, but he certainly wasn't one to give up. His experience fighting in the war and witnessing the deaths of his friends had increased his realism and situational awareness. And his current predicament was unavoidable. With a last smirk before passing away, Madara said, "If I die, then the shinobis will never have their hero back." Naruto was relieved that he could no longer sense Madara's chakra, which was the only indication that the man had passed on to the next life. His life's purpose seemed fulfilled, and his friends and family would at last be able to survive. Calm. Naruto carefully wrote a final message on a piece of sealing paper and placed it on the ground, wrapped around a kunai, as his last act in this world. Naruto vanished just as the kunai struck the ground. Having witnessed everything, Hinata hurried out of her spot and ran to where Naruto had been standing. She kept running even though her body was hurting from overexertion and chakra exhaustion. She went straight for the paper and kunai upon arriving at the scarred battlefield, ignoring the dead enemy. Two hardly readable words in Naruto's handwriting were scribbled on it, causing everyone near the blonde to weep over the death of a loved one. "Goodbye, everyone. Place. Mindscape." The fox snorted and smirked wildly. "And I'm back in this sewer again. How'd I do, Kurama?" Naruto stopped floating in the sewer water and stood on top of it, saying, "Not bad, Kit. Not bad at all. We finally killed Madara and ended the war, even if the consequence was that you had to leave the hidden nations." "What are you talking about, just me, for? Aren't you in the same boat?" he asked, tilting his head in confusion. The fox's body began to glow, becoming transient, as if to respond to his query. Chakra started to emerge from the fox's body, but it was gold, the color of purified chakra, instead of the typical red and deep crimson. Naruto looked down at his body and saw that his hands were smaller and that his favorite jumpsuit and sage clothing had oddly grown too big for him. Bijus like us cannot leave dimensions. We would mess up timelines and create huge paradoxes, which you would have known if you had actually carefully read your father's notes about space, time techniques. The fact that you are even able to leave with your status as Jinchuriki is strange by itself. In fact, there are already changes being made to your body. Observations revealed that the Kyuubi's chakra levels were rising. The blonde gave the fox a distressed and anxious glance. Naruto's voice cracked as he yelled, "No, you can't do that, Kurama. We're partners. A Jinchuriki isn't one without his Biju." The blonde's eyes began to well up with tears, but he chose not to wipe them away. He told Inari that he wasn't crying and that it was just water. Men don't cry. The one thing that had never changed in Naruto's life was Kurama, even though the fox had tormented him during his formative years. The demon fox and the sage had developed a somewhat close friendship, especially during their final year together. They relied on one another and assisted each other in achieving their objectives, one of which was to destroy Madara and the other of which was to bring about world peace. Both had been successful. Naruto's plea and the tears streaming down his face caused Kurama's smirk to slightly fade, but it reappeared when he saw that Naruto was still getting smaller until he was back to his early adolescent years. "You're such a loud brat again, huh? I may be powerful and almighty, but even I cannot go from dimension to dimension. However, my other half is rejoining with me, meaning that you will have full access to my chakra in whatever new dimension you end up in. K, you won't even need to ask me for permission anymore," Kurama clarified, attempting to lighten the mood. Hiccuping from trying to control his escalating emotions, Naruto silently gazed up at the fox in its cage. He approached the cage slowly and raised his fist, tears silently streaming down his face, once he felt he had regained control of himself to a satisfactory degree. Kurama's smirk grew as he brought his fist forward to meet the blonde's in a fist bump. "Thanks Kurama, for everything. For being an asshole. For making me suffer in my early years but giving me the best last year a shinobi could ask for. For being my partner and my friend. But what will happen to you when I disappear from this dimension, then?" he said. Kurama vanished as his golden chakra dispersed from the cage and fled into the entire sewer. "I'll finally be free, roaming the elemental nations once more with my chakra complete once more. I'll be seeing you, Naruto." Before he collapsed and started sobbing uncontrollably, Naruto kept his fist up. The hiccups returned as he fell to his knees and repeatedly slammed his fist against the ground, the mindscape trembling with the incredible force of each blow. At last, the consequences of leaving his home struck him like a bolt of lightning. Friends, Chan, Sakura, Shizune, Shikamaru, and even Kurama are all gone. He no longer had his constant in his life. The emotional dam burst. In the new dimension he would eventually find himself in, what would happen? Anything could happen to him, and he could end up anywhere. Would the individuals he encountered share his values? Would they be human at all? The blonde eventually composed himself and forced a smile. Pouting and acting down were reserved for the weak who had nothing better to do. After regaining his composure, Naruto sat down and waited, patiently with his chin resting against his palm as he methodically considered the countless possibilities. When Naruto recalled that he had not only copied the notes for the Hiraishin but also the entire jutsu index inside the Forbidden Scroll when he was getting ready for his final battle, well, if worst comes to worst, like ending up in space, I can go into my own dimension and study my San's signature technique to teleport to a world. Do I still have the notes? Wait, Naruto's mood improved. He had picked up a surprising number of techniques during training thanks to the Cage Bunshin and an unexpected revelation. He discovered that in addition to his known major affinity for wind, he also had two slightly lesser affinities for lightning and water. He had not yet perfected the full manipulation of his affinities, but those two additional affinities made training various elemental jutsus that much easier. Naruto was abruptly ejected from his mindscape. Startled, he opened his eyes and saw his new surroundings. As he floated in this never-ending loop of space, his blue eyes saw spinning circular gates, of which he was in the center. He saw that no matter what he did, he was unable to exit the wide circles, and the gates never ended. As he moved along the gates, the horizon, if it existed at all, changed constantly between orange and black. Naruto pouted and said to himself, "Whoa. This is pretty cool. But where am I? Well, that was a stupid question. No one's going to answer me because I'm alone in here." His usual demeanor was beginning to return. Naruto floated for almost half an hour before a tiny hole appeared in the room, into which he fell. Somehow, the blonde passed out when he fell through the tiny space gate, but no one knows why. Situated in the guild hall of Fairy Tail. Fairy Tail's third guild master, Makarov, sipped heavily from his beer cup before returning it to the counter. Right now, he was unwinding while gazing at his kids and fellow guild members fighting and making a scene once more. The old man sighed with satisfaction, perfectly happy to allow the bar fight to go on as long as it didn't get out of control. Urza and Mira were getting into one of their regular arguments. In a display of intense rivalry, lightning cackled between the two as they butted heads. While neither of them was using their respective magic, Gray and Natsu were engaged in their well-known rivalry battle in another section of the guild hall. Naturally, the other members of the guild were also engaged in combat, hurling tables and beer bottles, turning the minor altercation into a full-scale bar fight. Makarov looked up and took another gulp of his beer. Makarov could see that even his normally stoic grandson wanted to get involved. But Laxus was wearing headphones and was looking down at the bar fight with a disinterested expression. But since Guild Arts was currently on a mission that would take another month, there wasn't really anyone there strong enough to pique his interest. Makarov briefly noticed a high-level magical release, but he quickly brushed it off. He figured someone was in training or on a mission right now. However, Makarov's happy expression turned serious as he sensed the magical release varying uncontrollably and getting closer to the guild building. He opened his senses and saw that it was rapidly approaching from above the structure. Actually, it ought to have hit around. The members of the guild all shrieked or shouted, "Wah! What the hell?" together. In order to defeat the intruder, each member raised their weapons or assumed a fighting stance. But after the smoke cleared, it was discovered that the following had crashed through the ceiling and left a tiny crater on the guild floor. A member questioned, "A child? What's a kid doing here?" In similar bewilderment, the other guild members simply shook their heads. Nobody knew what a child, especially one that had fallen through the ceiling, was doing in the guild. Being the fool that he was, Natsu swore, "Fight me," while setting his hands on fire in preparation for battle. Natsu was immediately knocked down when an enraged Urza struck the pink-haired Dragonslayer in the jaw, causing him to crash into one of the guild's walls. As soon as Urza focused on the Ice Mage, Gray started to perspire heavily. Gray repeatedly shook his head, asking, "Were you fighting with Natsu again?" Urza was a monster who hit harder than Elfman when she was angry, so screw his pride. When the smoke had completely cleared to provide a clear view of the young person with platinum hair, the guild members kept staring at the child, all of them feeling sorry for him. The older guild members wondered what the little blonde had been through in the past as they all ran towards the unconscious boy, ignoring their earlier defensive thoughts. They noticed that all of his clothes were ripped and much too big for the young child. Everyone noticed that he had 3 tiny whiskers on each cheek when they were directly above him. Even though Makarov was still seated at the bar counter, he was now looking at the child with concern and curiosity. Concern because the child was hurt and unconscious, and interest because the child had been the one to exhibit enough magic presence to suggest he had at least A-class mage reserves. He was likely the only one to notice, though, that a golden object automatically wrapped around the unconscious blonde before the child crashed into the guild hall, acting as a kind of cushion and extending to the ground to slow the fall. This prevented any harm from being done to the youngster. It was safe to assume that the child would have suffered serious injuries if he had fallen without any padding. The blonde purr caused many of the guild's female members to squeal. One of the interested girls, Kana, had scratched a whisker on the blonde's cheek, eliciting the somewhat feline response. The brunette giggled and continued to play with the unconscious blonde's whiskers, resulting in the same response each and every time, much to the delight of the female side of the guild. The boys and men began to pout as rain clouds formed over their heads from the lack of attention from the opposite sex, except for Natsu, who was still cowering against the wall, staring frightfully back at Urza alongside Gray. It's not exactly the kind of attention that any man would want. Makarov glanced up to the second floor again and noticed that his grandson had changed his expression from one of indifference and stoicism to one of interest. After noticing the child's inner strength, the lightning mage became intrigued. However, he was a little let down when he discovered that the blonde was unconscious. That did not, however, lessen his curiosity or his perplexity about the origin of the young child. The guild master took another drink from his cup and stared at the large circle in the middle of the guild hall. He smiled for a moment. Fairy Tail really does treat everyone like a family, even if they don't know them. The blonde's cuteness was being discussed by many of the women. As a result of his neglect as guild master, Makarov started to weep to himself as well, his tears flowing comically down his cheeks. It was a real wonder how the blonde had diverted all the attention from all the men in a single minute. No man should ever allow that to happen, especially Elfman. But the master quickly moved past his main problem and decided to deal with attracting the women's attention later. There were more urgent problems, like Makarov shouted from his perch, "Get that child to the infirmary," loudly enough for the entire guild to hear. The women all answered at once, each one of them holding the blonde as though he were the most fragile thing in the world. The ones who weren't carrying him were merely observing and following the sleeping blonde's cute face. Makarov's stream of tears grew even more powerful and wide, and somehow the men's melancholy rain clouds grew bigger, forming a puddle beneath the little man. Indeed, the guild would undoubtedly become interesting in due course. Naruto's first thought was, I hate hospitals so much." He opened his eyes and quickly adapted to the light, which was a necessary skill for any ninja to have since they had to be able to adapt to any circumstance. With his head resting against a plush pillow and the cushion beneath him feeling soft, Naruto wriggled around and blinked a few times. "Wherever I am, it has better reception than the elemental nations. I would probably be in a cell right now. Wait, I'm younger, that's right. But still, even young ninjas were dangerous. Itachi is the perfect example." With his body still under stress from using the finished Biju Sage mode just hours earlier, Naruto sat up in bed and leaned against the wall. The blonde immediately assessed his situation and was content that no one was around, a minor habit he had developed during the war. It was near dawn, early in the morning. When Naruto turned to face the window beside him, he saw the sun rising and gliding over the mountains and town buildings. He remained motionless for a moment, transfixed by the scene, and then he turned back to his room. The room wasn't big, but it wasn't tiny either. The room, which was almost 15 by 15, had a cozy bed on which Naruto was sitting at the moment, a closet next to the bed, a window above the bed, and a cabinet on the other end of the room to the left of the door, next to a mirror. With some difficulty because he was still exhausted, Naruto threw his legs over the edge of the bed and got to his feet. He briefly closed his eyes to focus and became aware that his chakra level was low and that his capacity had decreased considerably while he had been unconscious. He swiftly entered his mindscape and discovered why. Most of the golden chakra went into the cage and was making its way slowly out to the sewer. Naruto realized that he had about 20% of the Kyuubi's purified chakra in the sewer, which was his current chakra capacity. The remaining chakra was still in the cage, unrestrained. Naruto sat down on the sewer in a lotus position and concentrated on his body and chakra points. It must be because my body can't handle all of that chakra yet. However, since my tenketsus are much wider with that much chakra, I wouldn't be surprised if I could control all of it in a few years. Kami, this sucks. More chakra means that my already awful chakra control is going to be shot. Well, since I have less chakra now, my control should have gone up, right? The fact that his golden chakra was flowing considerably more quickly than his typical blue chakra startled him a little. In comparison to the blue chakra, the purified chakra was also far more powerful and abundant. The young blonde then opened his eyes and raised his head to look at the enormous cage filled with chakra that had been purified with annoyance. Damn it. My chakra is even worse because the potency of the chakra is making it even harder to control. Screw new techniques and my Rasengan or even my variants. I'm going to have to practice chakra control until I'm at least Chunin level again. But what is strange are the floating lights that are just flying around the sewer. I've never seen them before. They feel light compared to the chakra I have. Reaching for one of the floating lights, the blonde with the spiky hair stood atop the sewer water. Naruto closed his eyes and entered a sensory mode as one of the light particles lightly touched his finger. His eyes snapped open in shock, and he smirked after gaping at the dim light. This could be helpful, very helpful. I could either use a seal to transfer this random energy into chakra, or maybe I could use it when my chakra becomes low as a last resort. But then again, I don't even know what kind of world I'm in yet. Therefore, up I get. Naruto got out of his mindscape and got to his feet. Then he walked to the door and looked at himself in the mirror. He reluctantly acknowledged that he was short once more. I can't just eat ramen this time around. I'll actually eat some healthy food during my puberty years since I actually have a chance to now, as long as I'm not discriminated against. Let's see. Same anorexic and malnourished body during my prankster years, which isn't good. I'm going to need to train to make all my muscles leaner again. I'm around 4 feet 10 inches, this really sucks, TT. But I lost all of my scars during the war and I don't have the Chidori mark where Sasuke stabbed me. Naruto gave himself a playful sneer and stuck out his tongue at his reflection, his counterpart doing the same. With that, Naruto opened the door and left the room, utterly disregarding the fact that he was only wearing boxers. At least I still have my whiskers, something I can remember Kurama by other than his chakra. The sounds of a bar fight reached Naruto as he made his way down the hall and down some stairs. He accelerated his pace in curiosity until he came to a corner. He turned around and was astonished by what he saw. There was a full-on bar fight going on, but what confused Naruto even more was that everyone was grinning. The fact that some people started drawing guns from the air only confused the blonde more. What? The victim was sent through one of the guild walls when a big man with long white hair made his arm absurdly large and punched someone with it. To punch another teen who was currently nude, a teenager Naruto's age set his hands on fire. At this point, Naruto's mind was racing because the blonde was utterly perplexed. Unaware of how accurate his little remark was, he muttered to himself, "They're just controlling the flames and ice, as if they were using magic." The scene in front of him, however, made Naruto smile because he was in a world where fighting wasn't weird and abilities like chakra were used. Regardless of his present state and attire, or lack thereof, that was all he needed to know before he descended the stairs to the guild hall grinning broadly. When Naruto approached the bar counter, he noticed a small old man watching the guild members fight while happily sipping beer. But the blonde saw right away that the elderly man was unwinding and observing the circumstances. Naruto likened the small man to a leader because, although he appeared at ease, he was constantly patrolling, as though he was prepared to enter the battle at any time. With some difficulty due to his aching body, Naruto approached the elderly man and sat down on a stool beside him. "Is it always like this?" the elderly master asked, horrified by the blonde's extreme thinness. He soon calmed down, though, when he realized that the blonde's slender figure concealed lean muscle mass and an incredibly durable, speed-oriented body. At the moment, Naruto was idly observing the ensuing full-fledged bar fight. The highlights of every tiny battle were captured by the blonde's cerulean, which flickered back and forth throughout the guild. The blonde would occasionally smirk or snort in mild amusement, and she once smirked broadly when Gray threw away his boxers and they caught fire. The master answered after 10 or so seconds. In an attempt to dismiss the master's surprised tone, the blonde casually waved his hand and said, "I'm surprised you don't think this is strange at all." He smiled broadly enough to flash his teeth and gave an eye smile. The master raised an eyebrow at that information, saying, "I've seen some pretty bad quirks. I'm not new to this stuff, don't worry." The blonde smirked and opened his eyes, asking, "Like you walking around in your boxers?" "Better than going around naked and fighting with ice," Naruto swiftly answered. The master replied, "Duly noted," and then let out a loud belly laugh, his amused eyes wrinkling upward. The child did well. He resumed their stalled conversation after Makarov had calmed down. "So, why are you here, little one?" the master asked, causing the blonde to twitch a little. When Makarov saw it, he chose to remain silent and wait to see where the conversation would go. The child had briefly displayed high magic reserves before crashing into Fairy Tail's guild building, but he noticed that they had essentially vanished. The blonde had sat next to the master without attracting his attention before, and now she was almost completely absent. As he took another sip from his beer, Makarov reflected, "I don't understand how he got next to me after just waking up in that condition. Right now, I can feel his magic reserves, and it is much lower than when he had crashed through the ceiling. This is an interesting child. I'm 12, and I'm not that short," the blonde sighed. He then kept watching the fights while leaning his back against the counter. The master tried to change the topic of conversation by asking, "Do you know magic?" The blonde briefly grinned, seemingly amused by the ridiculousness of the inquiry. Before answering, Naruto pondered, "Wait, this is a different world. We used chakra in the elemental nations. Maybe they use magic here. That would explain what those floating lights were in my mindscape." At the name that blonde gave him, the master snorted, "Isn't it right in front of me, Gigi.san?" However, this means that he isn't new or unfamiliar with the concept of magic. Maybe he can join the guild. He is old enough anyways. First off, however. Despite his desire to conceal his past, Naruto's face instantly lowered when he was asked, "Don't you have family waiting for you?" One thing he was unable to conceal was this. He could have concealed his suffering if he had at least Kurama, but now he had nothing to genuinely remind him of his family back home. "I'm an orphan, Gigi.san." Makarov felt compelled to assist the child as much as he could because of the way the child spoke and gazed down at the ground. He concluded that the best course of action would be his initial suggestion. "What is your name?" Naruto asked, lifting his head to look at the elderly man before using his thumb to gesture at himself. With a huge smile, he closed his eyes and smiled broadly. Makarov laughed and said, "I'm Uzumaki Naruto," before turning back to the guild battle to make sure nothing got too out of control. Naruto opened his eyes in surprise and said, "Someone named you Maelstrom. Nice name." The blonde didn't need to explain his name to the elderly man because he already knew what it meant. Raising his eyebrows in perplexity, Naruto asked, "So Naruto, how would you like to join Fairy Tail?" Makarov face faulted on the bar counter, causing the table to tremble a little. "What's Fairy Tail?" Still bewildered, Naruto simply kept looking at the elderly man with curiosity. The blonde did find it amusing, though, that the elderly man simply fell face first onto the counter while seated. As if to act as though the earlier incident had never occurred, the master eventually sat back up and coughed into his fist. Makarov gave the boy a suspicious look, and the boy returned the look, looking equally perplexed. Makarov questioned incredulously, "You don't know what Fairy Tail is?" With the same puzzled expression, Naruto shook his head once in denial. Goodness, he's even more clueless than Natsu. At least he knew what a guild and what Fairy Tail was. "Did you live under a rock or something, Naruto? How do you not know Fairy Tail, one of the most famous guilds in all of Fury? Goodness, you're sitting in a bar counter inside the strongest guild?" Naruto widened his eyes and cracked a grin. Makarov face faulted once more, slamming into the surface so forcefully that his beer cup fell off the counter. "Would you be surprised if I said I did come from under a rock?" he asked. While waiting for the master to rise again, Naruto calmly caught it and put it back on the counter. But he couldn't help but laugh when he saw the two boys who had been using fire and ice being manhandled by a red-haired girl wearing armor. Once more, the guild master resumed his conversation as soon as Makarov sat up again. Makarov grinned nostalgically before continuing, recalling his early years. "Fairy Tail is a guild, and we treat all of our members like family. I am the third guild master of Fairy Tail, which was originally established by Mavis, our first guild master. She came up with the name because she wondered if fairies had tails. In her words, do fairies really have tails? Do they even exist? Like them? This place is an eternal adventure, a never-ending adventure. So how about it, Naruto? Would you like to become a part of our family? To be a part of our guild and to start anew and to create a bright future?" Looking up at the guild master, Naruto rolled over. The blonde's eyes appeared to be overflowing with tears for a brief moment. Nodding, Naruto was about to reply, "I can have a family again. Maybe I can have another chance at having a family, like Ba-chan, Shizune-chan, everyone." However, a huge explosion rocked the guild hall, causing Naruto to stagger a little in his seat. When the master and child turned to investigate, they discovered that every member of the guild was on the ground, almost unconscious. They had been fighting for almost half an hour, but that wasn't the reason. Mira had made the decision to fully embrace her Satan soul, and the other members were completely taken aback by her extreme behavior. Urza continued to abuse Gray and Natsu while still conscious. Gray remained nude. It seemed odd to Naruto that the redhead didn't mind that the boy was naked, but who was he to voice his disapproval? After a moment of silence, Naruto answered with another sly smile. Makarov just started crying as he looked at the guild hall, calculating the costs to fix all the damage in his mind. "You have one dysfunctional family, Master San. Thought to himself, if we can blow things up, I think I'll fit right in." Naruto visualized himself fighting in a bar with his smaller explosive tags. He shook his head, and then his little smirk turned into a huge grin. "Of course, I'm going to do pranks, hee. Naruto started laughing uncontrollably in his head. Unaware of the blonde's thoughts, Makarov started to cry even harder as a weird tingle ran through his body, alerting him to the possibility of even more destruction in the future. With his hand pointing to the guild hall and all of its members on the floor, unconscious, Naruto said, "So, Master San, what are you going to do about all of this?" Glass was gleaming on the floor from broken beer bottles and cups. Tables were smashed and flipped over, and there were even some firearms on the ground. Rather than respond, Makarov just kept crying hysterically, tears running down his cheeks. The elderly man appeared to be holding a geyser or similar device. Naruto perspired before posing another query to the master because it appeared that not only was the bar fight frequent and always resulted in significant losses, but the master's response was also nearly constant. The master stopped sobbing and nodded his head once in agreement behind jumping behind the bar counter. "Okay, master. What can I do? I probably need new clothes and you need to sign me into the guild, right? Also, can someone escort me around the town? I'll get lost." Makarov leapt back up to the bar counter, took a book off a shelf, and opened it. "So, Naruto Uzumaki. This is just the basic stuff for getting initiated into the guild. birthday, age, birth location, where you lived, your choice of magic and your abilities, and then comes whatever random information you want to throw in there. Usually one of the women would do this, but they're all knocked out. Naruto started thinking in his head. He needed some of his skills if he had to, but he didn't want to give too much away and come across as suspicious at 12. After considering several options and scenarios for a short while, Naruto made his decision. For each of those in order, let's see, October 10th. I'm 12, figure it out. Age? 12, hehe. Birth location, no idea. Never figured that one out. Might have been a hospital or a forest for all I care. Where I lived? I'll just stick with under a rock for that. Makarov perspired, barely avoiding another face. Fault. Looking up and adopting a contemplative gaze, Naruto simply placed a finger to his chin. My magic abilities are clone magic, pure magic manipulation, seals, and wind. I don't want to give any other information. Too lazy. Other people can figure it out. Besides, they should want to get to know me before they understand me. Makarov agreed with Naruto's final assessment and nodded his head as he recorded everything. He was somewhat taken aback by how adaptable the young teen's list of magics was. In addition to being incredibly well-rounded, it was also surprisingly challenging. Despite not being regarded as a lost magic, clone magic was very challenging to perform at a high level. Nevertheless, he had never heard of pure magic manipulation. As he considered the boy's abilities and identity, Makarov thought to himself, it could possibly be a lost magic like Dragonslayer magic. I'm interested to see what it can do. Naruto was cringing at himself inwardly. He observed how the magics he named caused the master to appear to narrow his eyes. Did I names of the magic the wrong? No, he's writing them all down, but still, I think I said too much. Even in the elemental nations, having that many abilities would have been surprising, especially being able to use clones and chakra manipulation. We'll see what happens. Naruto tapped his foot on the wooden floor while he waited for the master to finish. He turned around and looked at the guild with his arms crossed. Given how frequently fights broke out there, the building was surprisingly pleasant. As soon as he saw that every table was made of wood, he agreed. Perhaps they wouldn't have broken if they were made of metal or another material, but hitting someone would have caused much more pain. Furthermore, it simply didn't fit the building's design. When the red-haired girl in armor began fighting with the white-haired girl, it appeared that the white-haired girl's recent victory in the bar fight was over. Their foreheads were clacking like lightning. The two boys the redhead was berating had made the decision to fight again near the opposite end of the guild. Naruto laughed. How they made him think of Sasuke and himself as children. When Naruto saw the fairy tale mark, he knew right away where he wanted his stamp. Okay, Naruto, last thing is where do you want your stamp and in what color? He asked. After having a mark there all his life, it wouldn't feel right without one. The blonde said, orange, gesturing to his abdomen. After giving a nod, Makarov stamped the mark directly above Naruto's belly button in the center of his stomach. He guessed it was something mental, but he didn't understand why the blonde would pick that. Makarov then leapt back onto the counter and set the book and stamp there. Naruto smiled at the old master and then nodded his head. Naruto, what do you mean by pure magic manipulation? You seem quite confident in your skills. Can you show me? He asked. I'm not surprised. If I was the leader, I would probably ask that first as well. I think he's slightly suspicious, but not because he's suspicious that I have too much, but that I have too little. That's weird, but I'll go with it. Naruto scratched the back of his head and laughed sheepishly. Makarov, however, simply told Naruto to proceed, saying, Anyo, do you mind if we do this somewhere else? I don't want to mess up your guild any more than it already is. Naruto cocked his head in bewilderment, saying, nothing is going to mess it up more than it already is. Makarov went pale and quickly dragged the boy out the back door and into a clearing, saying, the guild building could be destroyed. Makarov then gave Naruto the sign to demonstrate while leaping to a tree branch. After giving the master a simple nod, Naruto turned back to the ground. Naruto raised his fist and gazed at it for a while. My fist is so small compared to before. I don't have the chakra control that I did before. At max, it's a genin chakra control again. I'll just have to use all my remaining chakra to be able to do this even once, but I think I'll give Master Gigi.san a little scare with this one. He might start imagining me using this during bar fights. So predictable, hee. After clearing his mind of that thought, Naruto summoned his reserves and focused his chakra on his right fist. The blonde raised his right fist over his head, but nothing happened for a moment. Then it took place. After whisking out of his arm, the blue and golden chakra started to cover his fist, forming a kind of barrier coating. Then, as they fought for control of the fist, the two distinct colored chakras started to blend together. Naruto closed his eyes and remained motionless for a moment before resolutely opening them. "RRAAHH!" exclaimed the blonde, slamming his fist into the ground. The earth shot upward, rocks and dirt flying everywhere, forcing Makarov to leap from his perching branch. As Naruto had anticipated, the master turned pale at the thought of the blonde using the ability within the guild or on any mission at all. The costs of the damage would be outrageous. After the dust had settled, Makarov was startled by what he saw. The blonde's right arm was unharmed by whatever had covered his arm. The blonde was at the bottom of a crater that had taken the place of the entire clearing, which was almost 20 meters long. But the damage did not end there. It continued past the clearing and into a portion of the forest, uprooting trees and shrubs. It seems that coding was pure magic manipulation. Amazing. For a child to use that kind of magic at such a young age, he would be truly powerful in only a few years. The blonde gave the old man a thumbs up and an eye smile as she glanced up from the crater's epicenter and grinned at the master. Chakra exhaustion caused the blonde to stumble and fall to the ground as he took his first step up the tarnished earth. Naruto landed hard, creating a tiny dust cloud as he fell, unable to even use his arms to cushion the impact. "Meh, I don't think I've recovered completely yet. My reserves are so low right now," Naruto remarked, as if addressed to no one. Naruto was forced to lean against the short master's shoulder as Makarov leapt down, landed beside him, and lifted the blonde. Naruto's feet were dragging against the dirt and rocks on the ground because he was so exhausted that he couldn't even move them. But still, that is very impressive, Naruto. "Chan. How many times do you think you would be able to do that in a fight?" He raised his head a little higher, gazing up at the languid clouds that were gliding across the sky. Makarov grinned as he continued to drag the blonde towards the guild hall, opening the back door and escorting the blonde inside. "Maybe 5 or 6 times at most until my control improves. However, when I do, I can pretty much do anything with the manipulation. I can create small strings to grab onto things, create chains to prevent someone from moving, and a ton of other things as long as I can imagine it." Every member remained unconscious on the floor, either face up or prone, throughout the entire guild hall. Some were positioned at random. Elfman had probably struck the guild member, as evidenced by the man-shaped hole on the left side of the guild. Makarov laughed and nodded his head, saying, "Are there any clothes? I don't really want to walk around in boxers when they wake up." Naruto grunted in response to the master's insignificant comment about his height and size. "We have some clothes behind the bar counter that should be your size, which I find somewhat impressive." Naruto teased, "And where do they find clothing your size, Then the master said nothing, a gloomy cloud of rain forming over his head. Naruto started screaming at the master. "Nani? Oi, don't get me wet with that cloud over your head. Hey, stop it." Naruto was eventually dropped off at the bar counter stool, completely naked and drenched in his boxers. Naruto gave the master who had leapt behind the bar counter to retrieve some clothes a mild glare and muttered, "I hate you." The blonde rested his head on the counter and leaned against it. "I noticed that the air all around me has the unknown energy that is the same as in my sewer. Does this mean that the people use the magic from the air, or do they have magic reserves as well? I'll find out eventually. But my reserves are filling pretty quickly, probably a secondary trait from having Kurama in my stomach for so long. My body isn't as stressed as it was before using my pure chakra manipulation, most likely a result of releasing the pent-up stress." With a sigh, Naruto applied a little more pressure to his cheek against the cool surface, which was a welcome relief. A moment later, the back of Naruto's head was struck by a small weight. Grabbing the cloth on the back of his head, the recently reinstated member of the Fairy Tail Guild raised his head. His cerulean eyes took on the darker hues of red and black as he gazed at it, and he was a little pleased. Makarov leapt back up on the counter and gestured to the clothing Naruto was now carrying. Naruto looked up at the master and then back down at the clothes, noticing the wrinkles and dust. "Those are new clothes that were never used. Wear them and buy some clothes from one of the stores in town." "Do you mean new when you say it has been untouched for like 10 years? Makarov asked, ignoring the query and carrying on. Naruto turned to face the guild master and maintained a fixed gaze on him as they started talking. "You should probably go to town with Kana or one of the younger guild members. Kana would probably be the best though." "I don't know who Kana is. Can you describe her?" "She was wearing a sundress." Makarov's eyebrows went up. "Cool. You narrowed it down to 2 of the girls. Blue or brown hair?" He was shocked on the inside, which was evident from his appearance. Instead of speaking, Makarov continued, choosing to ask the blonde when they were closer, probably much later. He has a surprisingly good eye. To be able to remember that kind of information from watching a bar fight just once is not genius, however. It means he's used to gathering information and important details around him quickly. What has he gone through to be able to do that so effectively? Naruto nodded and grinned. Brown hair. She uses cards for her magic. The one that threw cards to hit the lights above people's heads, right? Makarov asked, nodding slowly, regretting that the cost of fixing the building would increase even further. After just 5 minutes of rest, Naruto felt much better and got off his stool. Hi. Speed regeneration appears to have been another trait he inherited from Kurama. Now that he was by himself, the guild master took some time to reflect as Naruto searched the guild hall for the girl Makarov had suggested. His power is extremely high, and he seems intelligent. That already is quite a fearsome combination, unlike Natsu, who is mainly power and all brawn. I don't know how bad his control or how fast he is, but his muscles and body type indicate he is capable of going into a battle of attrition with no qualms and is heavily based on speed. So, speed, power, and intelligence. Finally, he is aware of his surroundings. Add that all together, and we have one very scary mage. Currently, I would put him at high B class, possibly low A class, but I don't have enough information to make any realistic conclusions. It seems that we may have another Urza or Mira in the guild. Makarov grinned before a wave of fear passed through him as he recalled the demonstration Naruto had just given him a few minutes earlier. But he's as destructive as Natsu. Oh, this will be so bad. What will I have to tell the council? The council, oh no. Naruto was happily searching for any young girl his age who was currently unconscious on the floor, unaware of Makarov's present inner thoughts and feelings of dread. He eventually located the person he thought was Kina. The girl proudly displayed her forehead with her hair pulled back in a ponytail. He quickly acknowledged to himself that she was more attractive than Sakura and had far more inherent beauty than Ino had when she was younger. She'll probably be even hotter than Mei-chan sometime in the future. Naruto leaned down beside the girl and shook her to awaken her, shaking his head to clear his mind of his haphazard memories. He shook again, a little more violently, when that got no answer. Once more, it made no difference. After giving the girl a long look, Naruto moved away from her side and now stood straddling her. Then he bent down until his face was just inches from hers. With a twisted look on his face, Makarov, who had only witnessed the final action, became suddenly intrigued. He silently applauded, "Go, Naruto-chan. I know you can do it," supporting the blonde. The girl remained unconscious despite Naruto shaking her again and sneezing to the side. Once more, Naruto put his hands on her cheeks while leaning in close. Abruptly, he spread her cheeks out to epic proportions and pinched both of them. "Wake up, Kana," he shouted. The girl woke up as a result. As soon as she started to raise herself, she met Naruto's forehead. Because Naruto was keeping her lower body motionless, she was able to perform the sit-up motion more quickly. Itai, Kana used one hand to massage her forehead while using the other to steady herself on the ground. When she glared up at the blonde, Naruto smirked at her and got off of her. "And who are you?" "I'm Naruto Uzumaki, a new member of Fairy Tail." Kana's initially hostile expression instantly transformed into one of obvious curiosity with a hint of obvious joy. The girl immediately accepted Naruto's hand as he bent down to help her get to her feet. Naruto gave her a broad, foxy smile after she had patted herself down and looked up to gaze at the blonde. Kana nodded enthusiastically, always eager to add a new friend to her already expanding list. "Nice to meet you." Kana said that you know the town's layout and the stores for clothing? "Okay. Then can you take me around the town and show me some shops, please? Master put some money in the pockets of these pants so that I can buy some new clothes." Kana gave another joyful nod before leading the way out of the guild. Naruto laughed and then trailed behind the two boys who were being physically assaulted by the redhead once more. They both had beseeching looks on their faces as they gazed at him. Naruto simply waved and grinned at them both before turning to follow Kana, who was already making progress. Natsu questioned, "Who was he?" Confused, Gray shook his head. Urza sternly yelled, "No talking. You two fought again," while pointing her sword at the two. The two boys made the universal sign of surrender by raising their hands above their heads. "But you fight with Mira all the time," they thought together. At the moment, Naruto and Kana were strolling around the town in obvious joy, his smile gradually widening as they went. He cheerfully waved back to people who waved to him. The blonde turned around and grinned at every obvious aspect of the town, and girls and some women squealed at how joyful and innocent she appeared. Kana found a slight amusement in observing the blonde's expressions. After giving her a quick glance and shaking his head, Naruto asked, "You've never been to the town of Magnolia?" Before continuing to take in all the stores and structures. Kana chuckled, then stepped beside him and gave the blonde a shoulder pat. "Well then, welcome to Magnolia," she exclaimed with joy. She smiled back at Naruto as he turned to face her once more. They finally arrived at a store that Kana had suggested. Naruto gazed at the store before retreating a short distance. But Kana was not having any of it, and she grabbed the blonde's wrist to stop him from fleeing. Naruto gave her a terrifying look before glancing up at the shop's title. "C.A. Kana. This doesn't look like a store for boys." Kana grinned and pulled him toward the clothing store's entrance by pulling on his wrist. Kana enthusiastically exclaimed, "I know that Heart Cruise is mainly a women's store, but there are some pretty decent clothes for men, too. So don't worry and let's go." She was thrilled about the possibility of making a purchase. Kana became interested in the brand because Urza had purchased some rather nice clothing. The quantity of jewels that Master had given Naruto was evidently sufficient to purchase at least 5 sets of regular clothing, which would cover 2 sets from Heart Cruise. After Naruto had gone shopping, Makarov most likely anticipated receiving a respectable amount of change. As he opened the store doors, Kana thought cheekily, "Sorry, Master. My fortune-telling ability says that you won't have any change back today." Naruto gulped and winced as the door opened. At least 20 women and young girls in their teens were among the shop's patrons, and they all turned to face the entrance and focused on the blonde who was still being held by the wrist. Naruto screamed at the top of his lungs after glancing fearfully back at the group of women who were focusing on him. 1 hour time skip. Kana simply laughed joyfully while holding a bag that contained 2 sets of clothes, one for Naruto and one for herself. "I don't care what you say, Kana. I'm never going back to the store ever again." After changing, Naruto was now dressed in black pants that hung down to his shins. He had on a dark orange shirt with a spiral design on the front for his upper body. A white jacket with a cross on it hung over his shirt, leaning more to the right on his chest. Despite the sour expression that said, "I'm not amused," Naruto looked much better and neater overall than he had before entering the store. Kana mimicked the women in the store by drawing out the suffix and saying, "I'm sorry, Naruto. Chan." After flinching, Naruto turned to give the brunette a mild glare. "That's not funny. You owe me, Kana." Kana simply laughed joyfully while maintaining an innocent expression. When Naruto saw her expression, which conveyed her total joy and glee with an innocence that anyone would want to preserve, he too shed his sour expression and smiled brightly. Naruto would undoubtedly be on this list. Given what he had to endure in his 6 years as a professional ninja, he would stop at nothing to keep someone innocent. Naruto turned his head away from the girl and looked directly ahead, saying, Fine. What do you want?" The town's streets were now mostly congested as rush hour drew near. With a light wind blowing through the town, the sun was high but not too hot because winter was drawing near. Kana instantly brightened before describing her cards and asking, "Tell me about your magic." "I use cards as my main magic. I'm able to place runes onto my cards so that they can have multiple results. For example, I can make a combination of cards to make a tornado. Or I can just place magic into my custom deck of cards to make them into weapons that become kind of like shurikens." Naruto nodded his head in recognition of her useful power. "How about you, Naruto?" the blonde asked, looking at her with a hint of surprise. He had anticipated her inquiring, but not in such a direct manner. She was being kind to him even though they had only recently met, as though she wanted to get to know him better so they could become friends right away. Then, with a smile, Naruto turned off the cobblestone path and headed toward a forest Kana had previously indicated at the edge of a town. Although there were designated areas, the mages could practice anywhere in the forest. Naruto reflected with a hint of nostalgia, kind of like the training grounds back at home. Kana asked Naruto from behind, "Where are you going?" But she knew he was heading to the forest. Naruto grinned over his shoulder as he turned to face her. Kana became agitated and quickened her pace, now following the blonde as she said, "You said you wanted to see my magic, right? Let me show you a little trick that might seem similar to yours." Naruto eventually stopped when they arrived at a clearing in the forest. Kana paused beside him, anticipating the blonde's demonstration with great anticipation. What magic does he have that's similar to him? Naruto appeared to make an odd motion as a cloud of smoke unexpectedly covered his hand while Kana observed the blonde. A strange rectangular piece of paper was held between his fingers after the smoke had cleared. Kana's eyes widened as she gazed at it. She said, "That's like the runes on my cards." After grinning, Naruto gave a small shake of his head. The blonde turned to face the brunette from behind and then narrowed his eyes intently. I told you that it was similar, Kana. Now let me show you something that you can add to your repertoire of abilities. I pulled out one of my more basic tags, so this should be able to work even with my shoddy chakra control right now. Okay, let's show Kana some real tricks. The tag's timer didn't light even after Naruto used a tiny amount of chakra to start it. The tag started to straighten as tiny amounts of chakra were continuously pumped into it, becoming solid and hard, almost like a card. The card then sliced through the air and grooved itself deeply into a tree trunk vertically as Naruto threw it with unnatural accuracy. Kana gazed at the card for a while before letting out a disappointed sigh. Naruto turned around and grinned at her dissatisfied expression. Raising his right hand to shoulder level, Naruto snapped his finger and lightly flared his chakra, saying, "I wouldn't stop watching if I were you." The card exploded out of nowhere, destroying the tree and sending it skyward before crashing back to the ground. Kana gaped at the scene that had just unfolded in front of her. The blonde was just staring at her with a sheepish grin when she moved slightly to make herself look slack-jawed. Naruto laughed, scratched the back of his head, and started to leave the forest, saying, "I'm definitely adding that to my skill set." Kana joined Naruto right away and walked happily beside the blonde. Kana said, "Hey, want to do a mission with me?" She wanted to see what else the blonde could do because she was shocked to find someone who used magic similar to her own. In addition, she found herself quickly warming up to the blonde because she was so happy, open, and welcoming to questions. Naruto asked himself, are missions the same here as they are in the elemental nations? But for once, he made the decision to just go ahead without giving it any thought. If it's a mission, then it shouldn't be too bad since Gigi.san probably won't give us something too difficult, especially since we're still young. However, he might make us make up our deficit in skill by increasing our numbers, although I don't really need the backup. Naruto agreed with Kana and discarded the idea of going on a mission alone. After all, she appeared to be a pleasant girl and had shown him kindness thus far, making an effort to be as welcoming and considerate as she could to a boy who had crashed into their guild building. Sure. Let's go back to the guild. The Fairy Tail Guild Hall is the location. Kana said, "Gray, you're not wearing clothes again," as soon as she entered. The boy instantly swore and searched the floor for his clothes after glancing down at himself. Naruto laughed at the antics of the guild members and asked himself, again? The pink-haired teenager Naruto's age and the red-haired girl who had been manhandling Gray suddenly appeared in front of Naruto, her hand outstretched. Naruto gazed at the hand for a moment before turning to face the girl. Her face was full of anticipation. She wore her hair down her back in a long ponytail. She had a skirt on her lower body and armor on her upper body in place of clothes. "I heard that you're a new member. My name is Urza Scarlet," Urza informed Naruto. The blonde approached her, shook her hand, and grinned. As the blonde introduced herself, "I'm Naruto Uzumaki. Nice to meet you, Urza." No one would have made such an introduction if this were the elemental nations. People would have discriminated against him if it had been before the fight with Pain. If it had been after, they would have flattered him to the point of near worship, which Naruto did not find pleasing. Instead of hero worship, he desired respect. Naruto mechanically nodded his head in agreement, saying, "Good. Well then, I expect you to follow the rules and not create too much trouble." He and Kana started laughing to themselves as soon as Urza left them alone. Are members of Fairy Tail not causing trouble? Has anyone ever heard of that? Urza left to go somewhere else, and then a second girl approached Naruto with the tall man who could change his arm and another girl. As he got closer, he saw that the guy was much younger than he had anticipated. He was just absurdly tall, and that it was the girl who had won the most recent bar fight. The girl at the front said, "Don't talk to that bitch. By the way, my name is Mira Strauss." It didn't take Naruto long to figure out that she led their trio. When the smaller girl next to her, whom Naruto assumed to be her younger sister, said something to Mira, the older sister simply dismissed it with a wave. Using a euphemism, Naruto questioned, who's the girl you don't like?" Mira turned back, first to Naruto and then to Kana. Then Mira turned to Naruto and said, "Hey, Kana. I'll be seeing you in the S-class exams next year, won't I?" Naruto could tell she was one of those egotistical, condescending girls, and if no one else did, he would beat the living daylights out of her. With an authoritative tone, she declared, "Urza Scarlet. She's a complete bitch. Don't talk to her." At the sound of a sword swing, Naruto instantly ducked. Urza suddenly appeared in front of Mira brandishing her sword, but Mira grabbed the swordswoman by the wrist to stop her. Urza asked, "Did you call me a bitch, you skank?" before spitting at the red-haired swordswoman. Mira gave her a fierce look. Naruto let out a sigh. After joining the guild, he didn't want to witness another bar fight on his fight day. The two turned to face him together and gave him a fierce look. The two of you have so much animosity towards each other. They both said, "Stay out of this," simultaneously. Rather than answer, Naruto looked at the two girls indifferently while using his pinky to clean out his left ear. Then he said. Naruto brushed past the two and said, "I'm sorry, did you say something to me? I hope I didn't miss anything important now. Well, I'm off to meet some more of the welcoming and kind. See you too." Kana was looking on in disbelief as Naruto left. As they watched together without fighting for the first time, Natsu and Gray started to worry about the new guild member's life. They all thought, he's going to die, together. The two competitors nodded their heads and jumped after the blonde while staring at one another. But just before they got to him, there was a snap, and the two girls fell to the ground in a heavy heap, both of them uselessly. They both attempted to stand up, but for some reason they were unable to do so. Something heavy and pressing down on them prevented them from doing so. Kana, who was observing from a short distance behind, was likely the only person who comprehended what had just transpired because she had a vague notion of what Naruto's magic could accomplish. The brunette pondered, what kind of rune magic was that? Was it his rune magic again? But I only saw him drop 2 papers. To everyone else, though, it appeared as though the blonde had simply snapped his fingers, causing the 2 to fall. As ridiculous as it may sound, magic was magic. Didn't there exist dragon slayers? Naruto glared at the 2 as he turned around and walked back to the girls. He then lowered himself to his knees so that the girls couldn't easily glare up at him due to the height difference. The tense atmosphere was abruptly broken when Naruto smiled. Naruto gave the 2 a thumbs up and exclaimed, "Good job, you two. Using teamwork to get at a common enemy and striking when he didn't seem prepared. Good job. Pass. Happy ending." For a while, the 2 just looked at him in utter confusion. When he was turned around, they attempted to attack him. Why did he not get irritated? Naruto looked up at Kana and shook his head, saying, "Wait. You're not mad they tried to attack you when you weren't prepared?" "No, why should I be? This is fairy tale, and from I see, you guys fight all the time. If I say that you can't strike my back, wouldn't that make me a hypocrite? Use whatever advantage you can get, that's what I would do. Besides, I'm not as strong as you two." Someone coughed at the bar counter. "Nor am I as skilled as you." The same person coughed again. As Naruto concluded his final remark, his right eyebrow arched in frustration. "But if you let anyone have a plan or set up something, you're screwed." "What a man!" exclaimed the third white-haired family member. Naruto gave a small shudder and turned to leave, but he continued to use his gravity seal. Despite their best efforts, the 2 girls were unable to get back on their feet. After giving the 2 a long look, Kana reluctantly moved past them to join Naruto, who was now focusing on the mission board. Someone yelled, "Hey, fight me," to Naruto's right. Naruto looked from the board to the pink-haired mage who was speaking loudly. With a tone of indifference, he turned back to the board and said, "Later, after I finish a mission with Kana." Natsu concluded that Naruto's actions were as good as a promise after witnessing them, despite his continued confusion about how he accomplished them. But he wanted to learn more about the new man, so Natsu said, "Hey, let me join in on the mission." After a brief period of silence, Naruto smiled back at the Dragon Slayer. "Sure, the more the merrier. Why not? It was sweet," the Dragon Slayer grinned. Someone else asked, "May I join as well?" Naruto saw the boy who was always undressing when he turned to his right. His pants and shirt were already gone. Naruto said, pointing at him. "Your clothes," the boy said, glancing down at himself and hurling another curse. But instead of leaving right away, he continued to stare at the blonde while he awaited an answer. "Yes, you can join, too." Natsu, annoyed that Gray would be on the same mission as him, said, "Hey, who said you can join, Gray?" With an equally irritated tone, Gray said, "He did. Didn't you just hear him?" And then left to look for his misplaced clothes. Currently standing to Naruto's left, Kana gazed at the paper that Naruto had just grabbed from the board. After examining it, she nodded, removed it from his grasp, and walked to the bar counter. Makarov put his beer cup aside, took the mission request, stamped it, and gave it back to Kana. "Master, we'd like to take this mission. The group comprises of Kana Alberona, Gray Fullbuster, Natsu Dragneel, and Naruto Uzumaki. Be careful," he warned Naruto, Kana, and Natsu, because Gray was still searching the guild for his gear. Kana merely gave him a solemn nod of the head before the 3 of them turned to leave the hall, but Natsu and Naruto both grinned and gave him the thumbs up. Gray had joined them, fully clothed now, as they made their way to the entrance to begin their mission. Naruto didn't snap his finger again to release his gravity seal and remove the weight on top of Urza and Mira until they had left the guild building. You don't get the inside scoop on the king of pranking, but but for once, they chose to put aside their animosity toward one another in order to bring the new blonde member back with a bang. He will simply bring hell back with him, no matter how hard you try. I understand the distinction between a mage of the A class and one of the S class. There are 18 letters in it. Dragneel Natsu Naruto pointed to Natsu and questioned, "What's wrong with him?" At the moment, the Dragon Slayer occupied the entire space on one side of the train seat, forcing the other three to occupy the opposite end of the seats. Naruto asked, "Don't worry, it'll fade eventually. It's just a side effect of his magic," to which Gray responded. The blonde's eyebrows shot up as he kept looking at Natsu, the pink-haired mage who was complaining about how uncomfortable all transportation was and groaning in agony. With curiosity, Naruto questioned, "That's interesting. What is his magic in the first place?" Gray said, "Fire Dragonslayer magic," without further explanation. Naruto looked at the black-haired mage who was seated to his left at the moment. "Okay, then. Well, since Natsu is out of it, how about we three introduce ourselves to each other?" Naruto replied. Naruto went on before Gray or Kana could inquire about how to introduce themselves, which he knew they would do based on their prior experiences. For example, we can talk about our likes, dislikes, hobbies, goals, and then our magic. Saying, "I'll go first," Gray held up his hand just above his shoulder. He started without waiting for confirmation because he knew this was primarily a formality to learn more about Naruto. "My name is Gray Fullbuster. I like the cold and my magic. I dislike, well, not dislike. Okay, yay. I dislike Natsu. My hobby is to practice my ice make magic and my goal is to become the best ice make mage in all of Fury so that I can do something. Also, I want to make that stubborn Natsu admit that I am better than he is." Naruto smiled and nodded, though he was secretly laughing at Gray's last goal. Taking a deep breath, Naruto said, "Nice to meet you, Gray. I guess I'll go next. My name is Naruto Uzumaki. My likes are ramen, training, and my precious people. I dislike the time it takes to cook ramen and ghosts. Hee. My hobbies are to garden and to meditate occasionally. My goals? Meh. As for my magic, clone magic, pure magic manipulation, runes, and wind." Naruto concluded his remarks. "I told the Master Seals, but he probably assumed I meant runes. If I'm correct here, the two should about the same or one should be derived from the other. We'll see." Kana said, "How do you know so many? I thought you were mainly a runes person," her voice displaying some surprise. Gray was also intrigued by the blonde's wide range of magical skills. The blonde did not appear to concentrate on a single magic, in contrast to most mages. But his short demonstration showed that he was a master of runes. Kana and Gray thought simultaneously, recalling two distinct incidents. While Gray was remembering the moment Naruto dropped two gravity seals onto the ground and activated them when Mira and Urza had leapt after him, Kana was contemplating the explosive tag. Leaning back against the chair's cushion, Naruto waved his hand. The other two waited for Naruto to explain, but when he didn't, they left him alone. "I just feel safer knowing more. Besides, it helps a lot that my clone magic has a special benefit attached to it." Kana started her introduction after coughing into her fist. Naruto stuck his tongue out at the girl, saying, "My full name is Kana Alberona. My likes are my guild and my friends. I dislike, I'm going to copy you Naruto and Seima." Naruto opened his eyes and turned to face Kana, his curiosity evident. "My hobby is fortune telling with my cards, and my magic, as you already know, is card magic." But he said nothing and looked straight ahead, primarily at Natsu's distressed figure. The blonde remarked, "Well, it's nice to meet you all, especially you, Natsu." The pink-haired Dragonslayer simply writhed in his seat and groaned in response. Situated in the restroom, after dousing his face with water, Naruto raised his head and gazed at his image in the mirror. But his 18-year-old self, with a face covered in bruises and dirt, stared back at the blonde instead of the 12-year-old version of himself. "It's strange how I'm not surprised I'm in another dimension. It's like, I'm just going with it, but something's bugging me. No matter how I act right now, it feels weird. I try to act like a 13 or 12-year-old but I guess I'm still a veteran of war. I wonder how long it'll be until I reach the point before I left the elemental nation. Chakra control was shot. Let's see, my optical nerves should be about the same as before I left, but the speed at which my body responses might be slower since I didn't train much in my younger years. I'm glad I left about 200 clones back in the forest to train my chakra control. But I won't be able to use Sage mode since this body, well, it's just not ready for it yet. Neither is it prepared for a complete Biju mode either yet. At least another year until I can even use an incomplete Kyuubi chakra mode, not even close to Biju mode. When the train abruptly stopped, Naruto staggered a little and the blonde grabbed the sink to keep himself from toppling over. When the train came to a complete stop, Naruto exclaimed, "What the hell?" He unlocked the bathroom door and bolted out, racing down the aisle past other passengers on his way from the restroom to his new teammates. As soon as he got to his seats, he asked, "What's going on?" Kana and Gray were on the verge of sprinting down the aisle to get off the train after picking up Natsu in a fireman's hole. Kana remarked, "Mages blew up the tracks. We can't move, so everyone is forced to go out," but her attention was primarily on Natsu, who was moaning even louder as he was being lifted. "They're demanding that the passengers give them all their money and whatever valuables they have," Gray stated. Naruto said nothing, which was obviously not what he was thinking. On his first mission, Naruto thought, "Of course this happens on my first mission. Just my luck," but then Gray said something that caused him to rethink his initial assessment of his luck. "This happens every time Natsu goes on a mission. Somehow, he's a trouble magnet. Doesn't matter. Hurry up and let's get out of the train. We have some pesky mages to deal with," Kana replied quickly. The 4 members of the group were exposed to the explosion while they were outside. Naruto and his team focused on the mages. Kana and Gray instantly furrowed their brows and said, "Give all of your valuables and money to us and we'll leave you off, without too much pain." The 12 blatantly dark mages in front of them made Gray grit his teeth in rage. In preparation for using his ice make magic to fight, he ceremoniously dropped Natsu to the ground on his ass and stood erect, extending his neck and clicking his tongue. As he gazed at the 12 dark mages, Naruto sensed that only one of them was powerful enough to matter. Based on his perception, he was most likely in the A class. They still had the strength in numbers, even though the others were cannon fodder. Furthermore, the situation becomes ugly when innocent bystanders are included in the equation. "Well, if they want to play a numbers game, I can win that any day. But what can I do that would make this simple and clean? Misdirection." Naruto grinned. Although he never imagined doing this, it appeared that the moment was right. You know, desperate times demanded desperate measures. Without any hesitation or reservations, he strode forward. Naruto kept approaching the dark mages in the front of the passenger line despite Gray and Kana's whispers for him to pause and assess the situation. He smiled at his 2 conscious teammates before adopting a serious expression. A mage shouted at the terrified crowd, "What are you doing? Give us everything ya got." The fact that none of the passengers were making any advances or even reaching for their valuables was starting to annoy the mages. But they didn't hesitate to use force or inflict a small amount of death. No, they weren't scared to kill to get what they wanted. The crowd abruptly began to disperse and move. The mages waited, assuming it was the leader. But when the leader got to the front, it turned out to be a blonde child who was under 5 feet tall. The mages wondered who the child was because of the determined expression on the blonde's face as he crossed his arms over his chest and looked at each of the rival mages without flinching. Naruto snarled at the comment about his height and then grinned, anticipating the question, "Who are you, y'all little brat?" He made a cross with his hands and applied one of his trademark moves. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. He invoked in his mind. The blonde was encircled by a cloud of smoke. The original caster was surrounded by 12 identical blondes when the wind cleared the smoke. Except for the seasoned one who was sure of his abilities, the other dark mages retreated in shock. The blonde was a child, after all. If there was no skill to support the numbers, they were useless. But rather than attacking, the 12 blonde clones sat on the ground and unexpectedly each produced a traditional instrument. The original started hopping on one foot before switching to the other as they started to play an odd kabuki beat. All of the dark mages suddenly collapsed to the ground in a useless heap, with a very heavy weight pressing down on each of their backs. I am the most unpredictable mage. My very name brings fear into the depths of my foes and enemies. I am revered everywhere. The fact that all opponents bow before me is the reason for my fame. However, Naruto continued his absurd introduction, ignoring their now vulnerable states. Naruto had made 13 clones, not 12, while they were concentrating on the blonde and smoke earlier. As he hopped to his left foot once more, he thought to himself, "People assume that my clones have to be close to me, such a stupid assumption. I am the great mage, Naruto Uzumaki." Naruto concluded with a flourish, tossing his left arm behind his back and his right hand in front of him while whipping his head in a circle. When Naruto first encountered the perverted sage, he imitated Ero Sennin's pose exactly. At the conclusion of their instrumental introduction, all of the backup clones bowed. When Naruto was introduced, Kana, Gray, and even the barely conscious Natsu started to perspire. But given how foolish he was acting in this situation, they couldn't help but wonder how he could maintain his composure and treat it like a joke. The other black sorcerers on the ground were perspiring with anxiety. They had no idea why they were having so much trouble moving their bodies even an inch upward, and they were totally exposed. Naruto abruptly turned around and started berating one of the clones while pointing at it. The clone bowed humbly in apology, saying, "You missed the G note at the 13th measure, what are you doing?" The original Naruto continued to chastise the clone while maintaining a serious expression. "Sorry, boss. It won't happen again," he said. The clones all bowed as one and then vanished in a cloud of smoke, saying, "It better not happen again. The rest of you, though, good job, dismissed." How? Naruto asked, turning to face the defeated mages with a patronizing smile. Now, Kana, Gray, and a fully recovered Natsu were paying close attention and curious about how Naruto had handled the dark mages so effortlessly. Rather than replying, Naruto took out a paintbrush from his pocket. Naruto gazed affectionately at the paintbrush and said, "Ah, the paintbrush is so overpowered. Do you know what this baby can do?" Everyone in attendance, including passengers, downed mages, and Naruto's teammates, perspired at the odd blonde's antics. Abruptly, Naruto started making deliberate motions with his paintbrush. The 12 mages on the filthy floor watched in fear, but their focus was disrupted when they all fell asleep at once. Naruto gazed at the motionless, unconscious dark mages. Then he turned around to the flabbergasted viewers and tilted his head. As another drop of sweat trickled down the back of their heads, they all shook their heads and said, "I can't torture or interrogate them, can I? Well, there goes that choice." A few minutes later, the dark mages were handcuffed and taken away by a group of rune knights. Skip in time. 4 hours, Natsu cheerfully entered the guild hall after using his foot to kick down the door. "We're back." Several of the mages greeted the return of Fairy Tail's Dragonslayer with claps of the back or other gestures. Naruto, Kana, and Gray quickly followed. Naruto had a look of total indifference toward everything. He was expecting a bit more from a B-ranked mission, even though it wasn't too bad. Finding someone, obtaining their item, and delivering it to a different location was not regarded as a B-ranked mission. Conversely, Kana and Gray were chatting merrily about their recent mission success. The four-person group encountered a few bandits later in the mission and easily defeated them. Natsu had charged in and attacked the distracted opponents while Naruto was doing his absurd and distracting introduction once more. Before Gray and Kana joined in, Natsu had knocked out several opponents. Naruto carried on with his introduction until he was done, regardless of the fact that all of his opponents had been vanquished and that no one was paying attention. It was the ideal way to divert attention and mislead. Naruto instantly snapped his fingers after ducked and flung 2 papers into the air above his head. Then, as he took a single step to the left, he could clearly hear the sound of a heavy landing in his ears from where he had been standing only a moment before. Glancing down at the floor to his right, the blonde saw Mira lying there, stumbling to her feet. Naruto gave the white-haired girl an eye smile and asked cheekily, "Hi there, Mira. How's the weather down there?" With his eyes closed, she responded by growling back at Naruto on the ground. Naruto raised his head and made a full circle, surveying his surroundings in search of a particular red-haired armored swordswoman. The blonde was sent flying, though, when Mira suddenly leapt to her feet and punched Naruto in the face. Mira grinned as her fist struck the smirking blonde's face, but her smile vanished as his body vanished into a cloud of smoke. A mocking voice stated, I don't think that's very nice," from behind her. As Mira turned, she saw Urza struggling on the ground beneath one of the blonde's damned runes once more. Before falling into a random position in the center of the guild hall, the full focus of attention, Naruto took a step forward toward the white-haired girl. The two were the center of attention. The fact that someone actually made the two rivals team up and still defeated them while taunting them was unprecedented. The blonde changed slightly, and Mira growled at her. She charged directly at him at a high speed, and Naruto shook his head. Once more, Mira felt her fist pierce the blonde's face, but the sensation soon turned to emptiness. A cloud covered the area where her fist struck, and there was a piece of paper floating in midair that had just affixed itself to her fist. Unceremoniously, the gravity seal brought Mira down to earth, and she fell to the ground. When she looked up, the blonde was standing over to her with an immobile Urza on his shoulder. Urza could only move her eyes and not any other part of her body as she glared at Naruto. When the blonde approached Mira, he picked her up and slung her over his shoulder before moving to a table and setting the two of them on its chairs. Your teamwork was better. It was a good plan to sacrifice one of you to prevent one from getting affected by the gravity rune, so that the other could remove it later on like you did, but if this was in the real world, the person that sacrificed herself would either be unconscious or dead. But otherwise, better. Naruto laughed. The two girls continued to glare hatefully at the blonde. Most of the guild just stared blankly. Two members of Fairy Tail's upper class of mages, both of whom were low A class, had been cared for by the blonde alone. Additionally, only 2 skills were used. When Makarov noticed this, he became very curious about the blonde's knowledge of runes. On the spot, he was able to conclude that the blonde was very intelligent and highly aware, or simply very skilled at strategic planning. But when Naruto stopped grinning and spoke his next words, the atmosphere abruptly became tense. But for failing, you two have to be punished so. Naruto pulled out a paintbrush from his pocket, and the entire guild watched. Then, out of nowhere, he dipped it in ink and started sketching the 2 girls' faces, adding 3 whiskers to each cheek. Naruto exclaimed with a smile, "There, you two look so much better." Before leaving without taking off his gravity rune, the guild was even more surprised, though they were now hardly able to contain their laughter. After one individual broke down, the entire guild burst out laughing and guffawing. If the 2 girls had previously been upset with the blonde, they were now leaking killing intent toward him with such vigor that he would have fled for his life if it had been any other man. At the bar counter, Naruto joined his mission teammates who were reporting to the master, who appeared to be crying with joy. Naruto, however, was not normal and was accustomed to such weak killing intent that he waved it off. Makarov wiped his tears with his hand and nodded, asking, "Did something good happen to you, master?" Makarov opened his eyes, grabbed Naruto's shoulders, and started shaking the blonde. "It's a miracle. For the first time, Natsu, Gray, and Kana have reported that they have done no damage during their mission," he said. "I beg of you, please continue to take missions with them." Naruto said, Okay, geez. Calm down, Gigi.san, and then he took the elderly man by the wrists and raised them off shoulders. It makes sense that Naruto was unable to act serious because, aside from Urza and possibly Mira, no one else in the guild ever took themselves seriously. "But I expect something back," Naruto said right away. "Free apartment room in a nice complex," the master said without hesitation. In addition to saving enormous sums of money, he would also receive a lot of support from the council. The cost of covering the blonde's living expenses would undoubtedly be justified if Naruto could handle the 3 of them while on missions. "Deal," Naruto said right away. He didn't require a luxurious lifestyle. He spent his entire life in an apartment where he was defrauded and occasionally evicted. "Fight me, Naruto. You said you would." Natsu abruptly turned on the blonde, his fists blazing. Naruto nodded his head as he turned to face the Dragon Slayer. The guild's interest had been piqued by Natsu's challenge, and now that the blonde had nodded, it had reached an all-time high. They had only seen him use clones and runes. A true assessment of what the blonde could do was just something the members wanted to see, although they admitted to themselves it would be unlikely if the blonde could deal with both Urza and Mira at the same time with little difficulty. "I did say I would. Where do you want to do it?" "In the back of the guild is fine. Let's go. I'm all fired up," exclaimed Natsu as he started to make his way to the guild's rear entrance. "Wait. Are you Naruto?" The blonde paused and spun around to see a blue-haired girl in a sundress looking up at him, with 2 other boys standing guard beside her. They glanced warily at Naruto before becoming a little more at ease. "I am." "Why?" the girl asked, pointing to the seal that Naruto had applied to Urza and Mira. After glancing past the girl, Naruto noticed that Urza and Mira were once again moving freely, though they occasionally gave him menacing glares. Naruto waved and smiled at them both before returning his attention to the girl in front of him. "Nice to meet you, Naruto. It's good to have another member in our guild. My name is Levi Magarden," exclaimed the girl with blue hair, grinning broadly. As he waited for her to finish what she wanted with him, Naruto returned her smile. She indicated the seal Naruto had used once more. With a bewildered tilt of his head, Naruto asked, "This is an ancient rune, right?" "Okay. I know runes are similar to seals." "Cool. But I've never heard of ancient runes. Then again, I've only been here for at most a day." Naruto was thinking to himself. Levi shook her head, then adopted a contemplative expression. But Natsu was growing impatient, his body pulsing with adrenaline for his battle. Naruto resisted the impulse to laugh and said, "Come on, Levi, can't you wait until after I beat him?" It was absurd how much Natsu reminded Naruto of his younger self. He saw himself in Natsu because of his headstrongness, his tendency to jump into battle without thinking, his ridiculous enthusiasm, his unwavering loyalty, and many other qualities. Levi did, however, sort of chastise Natsu for him with her subsequent statement. "I don't mean to seem mean or anything, Natsu, but if I am correct, currently, you don't stand a chance." She turned to face Natsu. Remember that he beat Mira and Urza by himself, who are both able to beat you. Not only that but, Levi said, turning back to Naruto. When Levi suddenly remembered, she exclaimed, I think if I recall correctly from a book I read, another name for the ancient rune magic was, oh. It was Funjutsu. Naruto's eyes grew wide with mild astonishment. They know what real seals are here, but I thought everything here was based on magic. Wait, no, seals aren't completely based on chakra. It can be fueled by any kind of energy as long as the person knows the kanji and letters for the seal. Natsu, obviously not understanding, exclaimed impatiently, what's the difference? They're the same thing, aren't they? One has letters, the other has letters, no difference. Levi gestured to Naruto while shaking her head. Runes originated from the ancient runes, which are the seals Naruto uses. However, they are much more complicated and potent, despite how complicated our runes already look. And if I am correct again, you used a gravity seal, which is one of the most difficult seals to use, with almost perfect ease. That means you're a seal master, right? Naruto scolded himself for his negligence, thinking, shit, I knew I should have held back on that. Why the hell do I have to get caught by someone that actually reads history and knows about something that no one else knows? He had only been using seals for a day when he was already being caught. The master added his own thoughts, saying, I thought something was strange when you said that you used seals instead of runes. The old man turned to face Natsu and said, go and fight Naruto. It'll be a good experience and you'll learn something. He pointed to the back door. When Naruto realized the old man's plan, he smirked after staring at him in disbelief. Makarov was an expert at teaching Natsu through practical experience. When Natsu was younger, he learned by doing, just like Naruto. With his fists blazing again, Natsu ran out the back door and yelled, finally, let's do this. As he followed the excited Natsu out the back door, Naruto laughed to himself. Makarov leapt from his perch atop the bar counter and trailed Naruto right away. The other members of the guild gradually emerged, curious to learn more about Fuinjutsu and what would happen. All of the guild members, including Urza and Mira, were outside when they witnessed Naruto and Natsu engaging in combat at a distance of roughly 10 meters. Natsu smiled at the possibility of a potentially powerful battle, his hands and feet blazing. But switching to Naruto instantly altered the tone. Rather than appearing ready for combat, the blonde was holding a paintbrush in the air with one hand in his pocket. In order to get the guild members' attention and keep them quiet before he established the rules, Makarov coughed. First person to get a knockout or land a clean hit will be the winner. Ready? Natsu exclaimed, Osu. In response. While Naruto simply hummed back, begin. Natsu immediately rushed forward, burning his feet to propel himself forward. However, Naruto raised his right hand, pointing the middle and index fingers directly at the sky, and uttered a single word just before he was close enough to strike the blonde. Seal. Natsu abruptly collided with an imperceptible wall and collapsed to the ground. He got back up right away and made another unsuccessful attempt to attack Naruto through the barrier. Natsu tried to move away after realizing he couldn't move forward and collided with something against his back. It's over, declared Naruto. Natsu paused his struggle to give the blonde a fierce look. Naruto shook his head, saying, are you telling me to give up? And when did you use your seal? I never saw you move. I'm not telling you to give up. In fact, I think that the fact you don't want to give up is a good trait to have. However, you should understand the situation you are in right now. And if you want to know when I did it, remember what I said to you during the mission? Natsu asked Naruto, his eyes briefly going blank as he reviewed his earlier memories. Flashback. While on the mission, Natsu exclaimed, a tiny ball of fire shooting out of his mouth, Naruto, why didn't you just fight those dark mages? That would have been so much more fun and exciting. The four of them were currently waiting for the train to return to the guild town at the train station. Natsu, I already told you. If I don't need to fight or use any of my abilities, I won't because there is no need to. It's called efficiency. Runes are not very taxing on my reserves and they're almost limitless in what they can do. It helps that those dark mages underestimated me and also didn't know what kind of magic I can do, said Naruto. Natsu lowered his head and gave a little pout. He remarked, but that's so boring, it saves lives, Naruto said right away. Natsu looked up at Naruto's solemn expression. Naruto lowered his crossed arms from his chest and asked, what do you mean? Naruto raised his right hand and asked, okay, what would you rather have, Natsu? A battlefield where you set the rules, or a battlefield where it's anyone's game? The blonde concluded by raising his other hand. The Dragon Slayer said boldly, of course I would choose my own battlefield. That's easy. Calmly, Naruto nodded. Gray and Kana were listening a few feet away, conversing with Naruto just a few seconds before Naruto brought up the subject, even though it appeared that he was only speaking to Natsu. Correct. You would obviously choose the terrain where you set the traps, you know the terrain, and you know every single advantageous place. So, if someone comes into your battlefield and you don't need to fight, would you? Natsu nodded. It's the same thing. I had no reason to fight those dark mages because they were in my battlefield and under my rules as soon as they let their guard down against a seemingly useless and weak, 12-year-old mage. Natsu asked naively, but isn't that kind of like cheating? Naruto may have once asked that as well, but he had changed since then. No, he would exploit any opportunity that presented itself. He may be a mage now, but his true nature is that of a ninja. Naruto remarked, then you cheated to save lives. Flashback end. Natsu's expression changed from blank to one of realization. You set it up before the battle began when we walked to our position and my back was turned to you. Natsu yelled with reproach. Naruto nodded his head, his expression devoid of guilt or shame. Natsu snarled and took a deep breath. After feeling a tremendous surge of energy in the Dragon Slayer, the blonde leapt back, took out a piece of paper, and in 2 seconds, wrote a complete seal on it. The massive magical energy erupted from Natsu's mouth and shot forward as a wide beam at Naruto, instantly shattering the barrier Naruto had set up. Fire Dragon's roar. Natsu screamed. The blonde, however, chose to remain motionless as he watched the attack get closer and closer to him. What is he doing? He has to get out of the way, exclaimed a few guild members, concerned about the blonde. Despite their dislike for Naruto, Urza and Mira were little concerned for him. He would need to go to the hospital right away and stay there for a few months if he sustained the most damage from Natsu's full-scale assault. Levi stated, he's fine, which was in stark contrast to the opinions of many other guild members. They all looked to her for an explanation, but she pointed to the spot where Naruto stood facing the impending attack rather than responding. Every member of the guild turned to look at where her finger was pointing, and they all dropped their jaws in disbelief. With his hand raised, Naruto was sucking in the powerful attack with the paper in his hand. Instead, Naruto sucked in the attack until the last of it was sucked into the paper. What the hell? Fight me, Naruto. Don't just use your seals, he exclaimed. If his attack was a little stronger, then that seal wouldn't have worked and would have imploded. When Naruto looked up at Natsu, he saw a flaming fist poised to strike his face. Naruto lifted his fist to meet Natsu's, lacking the time to execute any substitution techniques or release a seal. The boys were instantly flung back by the force of the two fists colliding. Before coming to a stop, they both flipped backwards and skidded across the dirt. Naruto smirked as he turned to face Natsu, who was heaving and panting from exerting so much energy. Is he getting stronger? Then he's just like me, getting stronger when fighting against someone that is higher than him. There, I got you to move, Natsu declared with a sense of victory. Naruto closed his eyes, grinned, and nodded his head. Makarov abruptly declared, Natsu lost, without warning. Even Levi was perplexed this time. The only other person who had witnessed what the blonde had done was Laxus, who was observing from the second floor of the guild building. However, his viewpoint was different. Just as Natsu was standing there, a clone suddenly arose from beneath the earth. Before kicking him in the stomach and sending Natsu tumbling to the ground, it punched him in the chin, sending the Dragon Slayer hurtling into the air. Normally, Natsu would be able to stand up again, but he was under pressure. Pressing down, he used a seal. But, when, right? It was when my clone hit you. Seals aren't limited to paper. They can be infused onto the skin, Naruto remarked as he approached Natsu. Good fight, Natsu. Grr, fine. You won this time, but next time, I'll win. Natsu yelled at Naruto. After removing the seal from Natsu's stomach, the blonde reached down and took his hand, pulling him to his feet. Naruto grinned at Natsu when they were able to face each other again. You're going to have to get a lot better than that to phase me, Natsu, said the man. Natsu replied with a smile, ready to stop at nothing to defeat Naruto in the future. Winner is Naruto. Time skip, 1 year, in English. During the war, Shikamaru and a few other brilliant minds developed a language to stop some individuals from thwarting their schemes. Because he was a crucial component of every scenario and strategy during the conflict in the elemental nations, Naruto had been compelled to learn it. The new language was essentially made esoteric because anyone who played a significant role in the conflict had to learn it. In reality, very few of the shinobis were able to learn it. The spoken language was still the same as in Naruto's world, but it was the primary written language in the Land of Fury. Nevertheless, the blonde was occasionally asked about his old dialect by his fellow guild members. The sun had just begun to rise, and it was only around 7 in the morning. In a rare instance of indolence, Naruto was sitting alone at a table with his face pressed against the surface. The master didn't count because he was dozing off on the bar counter while holding a beer in his lap, so he was the first person at the guild. After a year, Naruto had grown 5 inches in just the last year or so, reaching a height of 5 feet and 3 inches. Instead of wearing a jacket, the spiky-haired blonde had switched to a long coat of any color with flames at the bottom of the hem, which was a custom order that matched his sage attire. As long as the shirt featured a circular flame on the chest, the blonde didn't care what color it was. Lastly, the pants had to stop close to his shins, where Naruto would wrap tape from his ankles to the bottom of his shin. Though the group tended to take increasingly higher missions throughout the year until they were consistently taking B rank and higher, Naruto and his gang would take missions of any rank with hardly any breaks. They eventually formed a somewhat permanent team, and they became well known throughout Fury as Fairy Tail's non-destructive team that completed every mission at nearly record speed. Even though there were nearly always issues during each mission, likely because of Natsu's knack for trouble, they were usually resolved fast, which improved the team's reputation among many mages and even council members. Makarov was actually praised and made fun of for his first non-destructive squad. Additionally, Natsu would challenge Naruto to a fight as soon as the team finished a mission. Naturally, the blonde would win easily in each and every spar, but Natsu was getting better at startling rates because the blonde was making the Dragon Slayer actually use his brain and be alert all the time. Furthermore, Natsu made the decision to train alongside Naruto. When Natsu first joined Naruto in his training clearing, he was astounded to see thousands of clones engaged in concentration training, meditation, or other forms of training. Naturally, this caused Natsu to become enraged and want to fight all of the blondes. In response, Naruto applied a level 5 gravity seal to the boisterous team, causing the Dragon Slayer to fall to the ground and leave an indentation. Thus, Naruto kept training alone until Natsu, using only his willpower, was able to stand up while the seal was still in place. Naruto then started Natsu's training by making the Dragon Slayer do absurdly difficult physical exercises, which Natsu hardly finished every day, a noteworthy accomplishment in and of itself. About a month after Natsu had trained with the blonde, Gray also joined in, but he concentrated more on his magic. Naruto offered some suggestions, including the possibility of controlling ice in midair and Haku's volley of ice senbons. Kana joined the group a few days after Gray did, but she mostly just hung out, watched the boys work, and occasionally cheered when one of the boys engaged in a spar, which was frequent because Gray and Natsu were always fighting. Both boys clearly felt the effects of the training, but Natsu's improvement was absurd. Eventually, during one of his spars with the blonde, he forced her into a close combat battle that was much more skill-based because the Dragon Slayer's speed had increased so much without the gravity seal. That was most likely caused, though, by Naruto's failure to support his blows with chakra. Naruto achieved Jonin chakra control, was able to use almost half of Kurama's chakra, and was able to enter a perfected sage mode after a year of rigorous chakra control training, physical training, and meditation. One aspect of sage mode in this world that caught his attention was how much simpler it was to enter sage mode. Over the course of the year, Naruto also developed the Eternano seal, which transfers energy in the air and transforms it into chakra. He started playing around with the energy for fun, though, and discovered that he could only use magic when his chakra reserves were very low. He eventually discovered the reason. At the moment, Kurama's cleansed chakra served as his primary chakra source. If he used most of that, though, his blue chakra would take over and replace the golden chakra, and part of his chakra would undergo a conversion process to return to Kurama's chakra, which would hasten the process of regaining the golden chakra. However, magic would be used if Naruto's or Kurama's chakra levels dropped to the point where they were nearly depleted. When he called forth 5,000 clones, fell to the ground, and the light energy entered him, he discovered this little detail. Naruto had become a vital and integrated member of Fairy Tail after almost a year of this never-ending cycle of completing missions, training, resting, and sleeping. Additionally, he was among the biggest contenders for the next S-Class trials. Since joining Fairy Tail approximately a month after the S-Class trials had already taken place, he had only missed them last year. Naruto abruptly leapt away from the table to avoid a certain pink-haired Dragon Slayer's punch, which destroyed the table. Disappointed that he wouldn't be able to unwind for much longer, Naruto sighed in mild annoyance as he landed a few yards away. "I hope you know I'm not paying for that, Natsu," the blonde remarked wearily. The Dragon Slayer let go of his flames and scratched the back of his head while laughing sheepishly. Naruto let out another sigh, but he nodded resignedly. "Meh, can you please pay for half?" he asked. The money was divided equally among the 4 missions, even though the higher-ranked ones paid more. Furthermore, the missions typically had a longer duration. The 4 would then spend the money however they please. A person would normally be content with the sum of money Natsu received after regularly completing missions, but his absurd appetite cost him a significant portion of his wallet. Kana said, "You shouldn't do that too often, Naruto, or he'll just become dependent on you," as she and Gray went through the guild entrance. Naruto turned to face the two and smiled and waved, and they both smiled back. Kana had dropped her ponytail and allowed her hair to fall naturally at some point in the past year. In addition, she had switched up her outfit, trading in her sundress for short shorts and a tank top. All 3 of the boys on the team had grown taller, but that was the only change Gray had undergone. With excitement, Natsu said, "So what are we doing today?" Naruto laughed in his head. Even something as dull as missions could not make this kid lose his enthusiasm. In a way, it was thrilling to see what kind of issue would arise because every mission had issues, but Kana's fortune-telling temporarily fixed that. She stopped fortune-telling because every time she did it, the event she had predicted came to pass. "We're not doing anything today. Today is the day that Gigi.san announces who is going to participate in the S-Class trials, remember?" Kana, Gray, and Natsu grinned and nodded. Even though they were only 13, they all believed they were ready for it, and if they succeeded, they would become the youngest S-Class mages in Fiore's history. "He's announcing that around 8, which is in an hour. Should we get breakfast?" Kana responded. The 3 boys' stomachs snarled in unison. Kana gave a wry laugh. "Come on, you guys. I know a pretty good restaurant a few minutes away." 20 minutes or so later, the 4 were dining at a somewhat upscale establishment. With the exception of Natsu, who was being paid for by Naruto, each of them had enough money to cover their own expenses. A round table with a soft white tablecloth was occupied by the 4 of them. As they dined in the serene restaurant, each was comfortably resting on the red velvet cushion of the chairs. There was a candle in the middle of the table, but Natsu had eaten it, so the fire was extinguished. At the moment, Kana was eating her cooked meat, Natsu was chomping on chicken as if it were out of style, Gray was savoring a dish of sushi, and the blonde was eating a steak. There was a cup of wine next to Kana's food, but Naruto kept her from drinking it, so it remained unopened. She reached for it again, but her hand was smacked away from the wine glass. "No," he said. She sulked and gave the blonde who was using a knife to cut another piece of his steak a fierce look. "Why not? It's not like something bad is going to happen. Besides, I'm certain that I can hold my liquor," the brunette replied. Naruto remarked, "I'm pretty sure that I can, too, considering his resistance to the effects of alcohol. However, I knew a friend that went berserk from a single drop of alcohol, so I'm not taking that chance," said the man. When Naruto was arguing lightly with Kana, Natsu suddenly grabbed the wine cup and drank it all at once. "Hey, that's my wine," Kana moaned. Naruto grinned a little and shook his head. Kana glared at Naruto after whipping her head in his direction. Naruto grinned and laughed to himself, saying, "That's not funny, it was expensive, and how come you're not chastising him for drinking wine when you won't even let me touch the cup?" Natsu burped and turned to glare at Naruto, saying, "Because Natsu will be the same with wine or without it. It won't make a difference in how he acts and thinks because he doesn't plan anyways." Natsu fist pumped into the air and said, "Hey, I resent that. I can think just fine. I'm going to make S-Class today, yeah." His tongue was a little slurred. Pointing to the slightly inebriated Dragonslayer, Naruto laughed. "See, still the same," Kana stated. "He's going to pay for that." Natsu appeared to get his bearings instantly and leaned over the table, his mouth resting over the cup. As they gazed at Natsu, Naruto, Gray, and Kana began to perspire. They all said, "What are you doing?" Natsu said, glancing up at them. Kana's face turned green at the thought, and Naruto and Gray grimaced. "If I throw it up, I won't have to pay for it, right?" Makarov leapt from his position on the bar counter and repeatedly flipped to land on the second floor, only to collide with the handrail with his back. Everyone who saw it started to perspire. Although their master was strong, there were moments when he was incredibly foolish or simply reckless. To get the guild's attention, the master gave a loud cough. The master of the guild raised a stack of papers and started talking after every guild member had looked up or stood up to pay attention. "As you all know, this is the time of year for our S-Class trials. After much deliberation among the other S-Class mages of Fairy Tail, we have conjured a list of the mages that will be contesting in this year's trials. So, congratulate your fellow mages as I begin," Makarov continued. All of the mages tensed up as soon as he glanced down at the paper. They had stepped up their mission load in the last few weeks in anticipation of this moment. Evergreen was the first candidate accepted. All of the mage applauded the candidate, feeling pleased and happy about the prospect of a new S-class mage. Bixlow and Freed, the two mages closest to her, both cheerfully patted her on the shoulder or back. You were accepted for this year's trials as a high A-class mage with a solid reputation among the council as not so destructive for fairy tale mages. Once more, the guild members in the hall applauded. Flipping through his paper once more, Makarov coughed to silence the mages. Right. Well, wait, what is this? A request? Regulations? Who needs that? Makarov said, rapidly going through the list while tossing a sizable portion of his papers behind his back. A minute or so later, Makarov was holding 6 papers. Right. Well, onwards we go. The next mage from our list is Bixlow. Congratulations. Evergreen and Freed turned to face the blue-haired mage, who was staring up at Makarov in disbelief. They both gave him a playful slap on the face. Since he claimed that he must have been dreaming, he asked to be slapped. Now that their team was all in the S-class trials, all they would need to finish their group was to be freed. 4 more pages remained unread as Makarov flipped the page. Evergreen, Freed, and Bixlow turned to each other and grinned gravely. The next mage is Freed. We have found your actions exemplary, and so, not only are we allowing you to take the S-class trials, but we have also put our compliments and hopes in you as leader of your group. Well done, Freed. They would shove one another to the limit. They wouldn't back down an inch just because they were a team. Makarov turned the page, but he narrowed his eyes and gazed at the paper rather than beginning right away. After that, he turned it over once more to the final page. Everyone started to perspire. Well, that's strange. He didn't read the results beforehand. All members of the guild waited in silence as they waited for their names to be called. The last 3 papers are all for one person. This one, we had to go to the Magic Council for. Apparently, the Magic Council has accepted our proposal after a long debate over whether or not they should allow it. The last person that is in the trials is. Kana was holding her breath and had her eyes closed. The guild master had an excited expression on his face as Natsu and Naruto looked up at him. Gray was stripping. Glaring at one another, Urza and Mira informed one another that it was her and not the other girl. Before Makarov announced the final competitor, the tension in the room was tangible. Then his mouth started to move. To improve their hearing, everyone leaned in. Naruto Uzumaki. The response was met with dead silence. The youngest age ever to compete in the S-class trials, Makarov had asked a 13-year-old to do so. Well, that was absurd, but he had a lot of leeway because this was fairy tale. But really, in addition to accepting the request, the Magic Council did so without criticizing the master. What had happened to the world? The entire guild exclaimed simultaneously, their incredulity palpable. Mira and Urza had to reluctantly acknowledge that the blonde was a better fit for the final position than either of them, but only Naruto's team thought it was entirely reasonable. Makarov held up his hand to indicate silence. He was immediately given the floor again by the guild. These aren't my words. The council has spoken. The Magic Council has accepted the request due to one Naruto Uzumaki's exemplary behavior during missions. He has not once caused destruction during his stay in Fairy Tail, has filed complete mission reports with no potholes, and is also a high A-class mage. His unrivaled use of ancient rune magic, an extremely esoteric magic that may be only currently accessible to him, has made him a high contender for the placements. Adding to his already distinguished repertoire of magic abilities are wind, clone magic, and pure magic manipulation. With these circumstances and conditions given, we, the council, have accepted your request and have given permission for Naruto Uzumaki to partake in the S-class trials. And then the rest of the paper goes on to say random things that aren't really important. Everyone turned to stare at the blonde in surprise at the amount of things that he can perform, a majority of them which the guild had no idea of. He was already a master of his clone magic and his ancient rune magic, and they had never seen him use either of them. Who was to say he wasn't skilled in the manipulation of wind and pure magic, 2 forms of magic they were unfamiliar with? The blonde was suddenly viewed by the guild as someone who was absurdly overpowered at such a young age. Naruto turned his head away from his fellow guild members and moaned. But the quiet was broken when everyone in the guild started applauding and supporting the blonde. Makarov spoke for the final time about the S-class trials after the commotion had subsided and everyone had ceased congratulating the blonde by giving him a few too many back pats. Makarov's voice boomed through the guild hall as he declared, "The trials are to take place next week on an island about 5 hours away by boat. Choose your partner and choose well. That is all the information I am giving out. Congratulations to all that have been chosen and good luck." After a few minutes, Makarov was back at the bar counter when Naruto approached him. Naruto uttered the words, "You didn't have to read off my abilities. That just made the competition that much more difficult, quite irritably. Makarov raised his head and smiled knowingly. Naruto turned to face Makarov and said, they would find out sooner or later. Besides, they're your family, so why not? When he didn't hear back, Naruto sighed, deception is key. If I never used those abilities, it was for a reason, don't you think? Naruto pointed to the other members of the guild and remarked, it doesn't matter. It's not like they know what I can do with them anyways. Makarov wondered what the blonde had meant when she said that no one knew what he could actually do, and Naruto left with the master watching his back. Makarov took another sip of his beer, only to discover it was empty, and mused, this year's S-class trials are sure to be interesting. Naruto was walking toward his group in another part of the guild hall. They all congratulated him right away when they saw him. As Kana gave the blonde a gentle hug and Gray gave Naruto a fist bump, Natsu started talking non-stop. Naruto spoke, forcing the ecstatic Dragon Slayer to stop. Both Gray's and Natsu's eyes widened in shock when he said, Gray, I want you to be my partner for the S-class trials. One was surprised because he hadn't anticipated it, while the other felt he deserved to be Naruto's partner. But Natsu didn't say anything. Being on Naruto's team for a year taught him that the blonde always had a reason for his actions. Naruto nodded his head in agreement with the statement, saying, are you sure? I mean, wouldn't your wind magic go better with Natsu? After all, fire and wind together make an extremely good combination, doesn't it? That is true. However, the trials aren't to see how destructive I can be. It's to see how I control myself in any situation, at least that's what I think. If I'm correct, we're also going to have to fight one of the S-class mages, which means Midogen, who I still have never seen enter the guild, Laxus, Guildarts, or Master. Either way, destruction won't work on any of them if what you told me about their skill set is true. You would be a better partner overall in this situation. So, do you accept, or do I have to take Kana? Gray started to nod his head. Naruto turned to the boy with the pink hair and asked, hey, why would I be last? As he started to run out of justifications. Because you wouldn't be able to fight evenly against any of the S-class mages for even a minute, based on your stats currently. You are too excitable, which is why I would go with Gray or Kana. And finally, I don't need to destroy any islands. Natsu's face lit up. Naruto sighed and pressed his fingers to his forehead, but he didn't deny it, which Kana and Gray saw. If you and I work together, we can destroy an island. That's so cool, he said. The blonde then raised her head to concentrate on Gray. Okay. For the next week, I'm going to train with you only and I'm going to show you some of my real magic so that you don't get too surprised during battles if we have any. Alright. Gray raised his eyebrows. Naruto turned around after saying that, and he and Gray started to leave the guild. Ursa and Mira were waiting for the two boys, or more precisely, Naruto, on the way out. When they were only a few feet from the two girls, the two boys stopped moving. Ursa and Mira started to falter as they prepared to respond to the question, do you want to say something? Con.co. Congratulations. They exclaimed simultaneously, though their tone suggested that they were more angry than anything else. Naruto's gaze lifted. Ursa nodded her head and started to leave, saying, thanks. But Mira wasn't finished. But, why did they choose you over me, or even Ursa? We're older and we should be strong enough, right? You're only 13. Naruto shook his head right away, but not because he disagreed with her logic. Naruto said, what's the difference between an S-class mage and an A-class mage? Don't tell me 18 letters. That's something Natsu said, which caused Mira, who is typically irate, to chuckle. Well, only annoyed or furious with the blonde. Naruto started to pass the girl, but stopped when he was shoulder to shoulder with her, facing the other way. Isn't it strength and intelligence? Like planning and stuff? I mean, I don't like to admit but you're definitely better than us in tactics, but I've never seen you actually use strength. Then what made you a better candidate? Let me tell you something you already know. This world isn't all rainbows and butterflies and happy. It's a dark world and a light world, and it's not really fair either. The only fair thing I can say for certain are the 24 hours in a day given to each person. You do what you do with your time. I trained every day until I couldn't move anymore, and Natsu worked with me every day. But that's not the point. Here's the difference between you and me. Naruto started walking again. He stopped just in time to walk past the girl, putting himself shoulder to shoulder with her. Mira listened intently, anticipating the sage counsel the blonde would offer. What a treasure this would be. She would gain knowledge and surpass Ursa. Naruto uttered, I'm just better than you, before she realized what the blonde had said. Mira remained silent, the words reverberating in her mind. He and Gray had already left when she turned to punch the blonde, a seal tag in midair as her fist approached too fast to halt. There was a scream of outrage and a loud thump close to the front of the guild. Don't worry about reluctant respect. That blonde bastard was something she detested. Time skip. 1 week, currently standing on a ship that had recently arrived at the island were Naruto, Gray, and the other candidates along with their partners. Tall, scratch-that, enormous trees that literally stood hundreds of feet tall encircled the island. But there was a massive clearing, at least a few miles in diameter, in the middle of the trees. The ship could see a mountain with 8 large protruding rocks on one side of the clearing, which was nearly 10 miles away. Now, we officially begin the S-Class trials. This is the first of 3 parts of the trials. Reach the rocks over there that look like stumps, Makarov stated. Everyone in the group started to perspire. Naruto thought sarcastically, wow, such describing words. Let the wise words of Makarov be told in the history books in the future. After saying, the last group to arrive will be disqualified. Begin. Makarov vanished into a mist, proving he was merely a thought projection. The 4 groups remained motionless for a moment. Then they started running for the tree line, blocking each other with attacks and spells as they went, and chaos ensued. Gray had to wait with Naruto because he stayed behind. The blonde then produced a try. Hong Kanai, which Gray had discovered was among her most valuable seals and kanais. Grab onto me. This ride is gonna get a little funky, said Naruto. With chakra supporting his throw, the blonde threw the kanai as hard as he could. Naruto and Gray vanished in an orange flash after the kanai had flown for almost a mile. They then reappeared in the air nearly 100 feet high, far ahead of the other competitors. Naruto threw his kunai once more and screamed behind him, "See ya, suckers," instead. After saying, "Hiraishin no Jutsu," Naruto and Gray vanished once more in a flash. Clearly, they were by far the first. According to Naruto, they had a strong start to the trials since they arrived first with a sizable lead and were given almost 10 minutes to rest before the other teams arrived. That was fast, Makarov remarked as Naruto and Gray emerged in an orange flash, the blonde inserting his try. Hong Kanai into his skin seal. Both Naruto and Gray grinned as they looked up. Naruto assertively stated, "Don't underestimate seals. Like I said, they're literally limitless in what they can do." Makarov grinned and instructed the boys to hold off until the other competitors joined them. In preparation for the next phase of the trials, the blonde and black-haired competitors took a seat on the dirt atop the tall, level clearing. For a while, the blonde sat motionless, using meditation to absorb the natural energy from the surrounding atmosphere. The blonde started to use his senses to see what was happening with the other competitors after he had switched into Sage mode, which neither Makarov nor Gray had noticed because Naruto had concealed his chakra level by enhancing his control. He was instantly grateful for his San's signature technique when he discovered them. The 3 groups were casting spell after spell, rapidly depleting their magic reserves. Naruto sensed that they were running low on reserves. The blonde's chakra reserves were absurdly high, and his purified chakra was also very powerful, so it wouldn't really be an issue. But for whatever was to happen next in the trials, he needed Gray to be in peak form. After exiting Sage mode, Naruto produced 10 clones, each of whom started grabbing sealing paper from their own pouches and using a paintbrush to draw different seals. With one of his more intricate seals, Naruto joined them. When Naruto drew seals, whether in combat, during training, or even during breaks, Gray, who was observing, was always spellbound. To him, it was an artistic creation. The ease with which he could make such exquisitely intricate runes without ever stopping his motion, all while using the delicate tool known as a paintbrush, astounded Gray each time he saw it. Gray said, "What are you doing?" The seals were more important at the moment, so none of the blondes actually looked up from their work to look at Gray when one of the clones answered. Gray nodded, choosing to leave the blonde to his work. "We're making seals for any kind of situation. We don't know what's going to happen for the next part of the trials, or the last part either, so the more diverse our seals are, the better chance we have of passing." He had once attempted to learn runes after witnessing how easily Naruto had defeated Urza and Mira using seals, but he soon gave up when he realized how difficult the magic was. The Ice Make Mage would be perplexed for a year as to how the blonde could not only read and write seals but also use ancient runes, a more complex kind of rune magic. 10 minutes or so later, the first of the other 3 competitors showed up with their parents. Despite finishing second to Naruto, Free didn't appear overly worn out. The arriving mage was congratulated by Makarov and instructed to wait, which he did, but before taking a seat, he glanced at Naruto. He was probably taken aback by Naruto's demonstration of teleportation just a short while earlier. After another minute, Evergreen entered and said that the mage was okay, but she had scared Bixlow on the way. Makarov got up from a rock on the floor and nodded. To the three of you that have made it, you will continue on to the next stage of the S-class trials. If you walk straight past me for 5 minutes, you will find an entrance to some sort of cave. There will be 3 tunnels, one for each of you. You cannot fight amongst each other on the way or you forfeit your position in the trials. Begin, said Makarov. The old man then leapt away, heading toward the boat, where he discovered the terrified Bixlow in the center of the spacious clearing. For a moment, the 3 surviving pairs remained motionless on the ground. After patting down his sage coat and pants, Naruto got to his feet and started to move forward. He said, "Let's go, Gray," without looking back. With a sly smile, Gray stood up and began to pursue Naruto. Freed and Evergreen trailed behind the blonde after a short while. In contrast to the blonde, who was using nearly all of her magic, they were only using 3/4 of it. Freed caught up to the blonde and said nothing, then started talking. When Naruto didn't answer, silence fell on the two as the blonde considered telling the other S-class candidate his method. "What seal was that you used to teleport?" she asked. He already saw it, so why not? It's one of my most complicated seals. It allows to instantly teleport to wherever my seal currently is, Naruto said. Evergreen, Freed, and their 2 partners' eyes widened in surprise. Whoever is holding onto me is also teleported at the same time, as you saw with me and Gray. I noticed you said one of your most complicated seals. You have seals that are even more extreme than your ability of instant transportation? Freed asked. Naruto shut his mouth, then he said. That's something you'll find out for yourself when I use it. Like I said, seals are limitless in their potential as long as you have the imagination to create it. After that, the blonde stopped talking, so the rest of the group didn't ask any more questions and remained silent the rest of the way to the tunnels. The 3 groups eventually discovered that the underground tunnel actually divided into 3 paths after passing the entrance and descending the stairs. Something's strange about this tunnel, though. The surface and the cuts are too neat. Tools weren't used in the making of his underground passage. It had to be earth-based magic, Naruto thought to himself. Without waiting for an answer, Naruto said, "Good luck to you all," and he followed the path down the center, Gray standing next to the blonde. This was the first time Gray had seen the blonde so focused on business since he had first met Naruto. The blonde had always introduced himself randomly or treated enemies like a joke on every mission, though the latter may have been done to divert attention. "I've never seen you so serious before, Naruto," Gray remarked casually. Naruto smirked, breaking out of his serious expression for a moment before returning to it right afterwards. "When I was meditating back on the top of the clearing, I went into a sensory mode to find out how our competition was doing. However, I felt 3 other large magic reserves in the opposite direction. The largest one was down the middle." Gray dropped his jaws and widened his eyes in shock. "You're kidding me. You purposely chose the middle? It wasn't just because you felt like it or due to chance?" Naruto shook his head. "Nope. I think my luck is almost godly, but this time, I chose our path. And this path is straight towards Gildarts," the blonde said, eagerness literally spilling out of his words. Gray swallowed in mild terror. Throughout Fury, all mages knew Gildarts, the ace of fairy tale. In a sense, he was on par with Master. Since none of the guild members had ever forced the man to move a single foot, none of them could truly get him to take things seriously. Because of his abilities and mission list, he was unofficially regarded as an SS. Class Mage. The Ice Mage wondered what Naruto was up to when he saw him approaching the monster with a serious expression on his face but a savage grin hidden behind it. The 2 boys walked for a few minutes before entering a vast, empty room that was at least as large as a large palace hall. With a high-pitched sound that reverberated throughout the room several times, Naruto whistled in appreciation of the spacious space. Naruto lowered his gaze from the ceiling to directly in front of him and said, "So, I have the youngest mage to participate in the S-class trials of all time. How interesting this will be." Gildarts Clive was grinning as his black cape billowed gently in an imaginary wind. With a sheepish laugh, the boy scratched the back of his head and said, "I heard many things about you during my short stops at the guild, Naruto." "Ma, I hope they were good things," Naruto remarked. Gildarts nodded his head and laughed. Gildarts stated without taking a defensive stance, "Yes, they were all compliments to you. But I want to see for myself, so come at me with everything you got." The number 1 unpredictable mage. Immediately, Naruto's sheepish expression turned serious. Gray was trembling a little from anxiety and fear at the thought of facing Fairy Tail's top mage. "Gray, I'm going to do my best, so help me out here. I'll do everything I can to prevent you from getting into too much harm." "Can you do this?" replied Naruto. Gray glanced at the serious look on the blonde's face. The mage found his resolve, ceased to tremble, and gave Gildarts a resolute glare. He would do it if Naruto was depending on him. "Yay, you can count on me," declared Gray resolutely. Naruto's expression shifted from seriousness to a savage grin. "Yes, it would be enjoyable." "Good. Create a floor about 5 feet above the ground that spread throughout the whole room. I know it'll be difficult to create something that large, but my plan requires this. Make sure it is thick enough so that it won't break easily, alright?" Gray nodded and started to let loose his powers. Ice make. Floor. Gildarts, Naruto, and Gray all leapt to their feet as a massive sheet of ice covered the entire space, precisely 5 feet above the original floor. Each of the three reacted differently when they landed on the new floor. Gray had no trouble walking on the ice because he was already accustomed to fighting on a slippery surface. For stability, Naruto had to focus his chakra on his feet. At last, Gildarts simply stood motionless and grinned, curious to see where the blonde's scheme would take him. Makarov described the blonde as a brilliant strategist. Naruto felt 20% of his chakra leave his body as 1,002 clones appeared beneath the ice floor. "I'm going to need at least 5 minutes to do this, so, Taju Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Massive shadow clone technique. 1,000 should be enough," he thought to himself. Gildarts sensed the blonde's enormous surge of energy and was perplexed when nothing materialized. But he would give the blonde the benefit of the doubt because he trusted Makarov when the master claimed that the blonde was skilled at deceit and strategies. A cloud of smoke revealed 12 more clones that Naruto had created. They were seen sitting on the ice floor with instruments on their laps when the smoke cleared. Naruto started to hop on one foot and dance as soon as they played the opening note of his now famous introduction, which was well known throughout Fury. As he finished with a wild pose, standing on one leg with his left arm behind the blonde and his right arm in front, Naruto exclaimed loudly, "I am the #1 unpredictable mage. I am a contender for the S-class trials of X779 at the age of 13. Women who see me swoon. Men who see me tremble. My name is Naruto Uzumaki." His voice echoed throughout the cavernous rock room. Gray stayed serious because he was accustomed to it and understood that the blonde was buying time for whatever scheme he had. But since it was Gildart's first time meeting the blonde, he had a different opinion. As Naruto slipped on his foot and fell face first onto the ice floor, he yelled, "Is this really the mage that Makarov was confident in?" Gildart's sweat drop was now big enough to form a tiny puddle beneath the incredibly strong man, and Gray was sweating along with him. Naruto shouted, "Rasengan, spiraling sphere!" from behind Gildarts, the cloned Naruto on the floor that slipped vanishing in a cloud of smoke. Gildarts instantly released his crash magic, widening his eyes and shooting his hand behind his back. When Naruto attempted to advance after feeling as though he had struck a barrier, he discovered that his golden Rasengan was gradually vanishing. Gildarts then applied more magical pressure to the blonde's attack, forcing him back. The blonde and Gray were now standing on opposite ends of the strong mage after Naruto swooped backwards into the air. After creating a clone, Naruto vanished in an orange flash and reappeared beside Gray, who was wearing a particular seal on his right arm. With a tone of disbelief, Gray asked, "He was able to catch that?" As he gazed at the mage, Naruto produced a tri-ponged kunai and held it in his left hand. He had already concluded that crash magic was essentially similar to Shinra Tensei based on that one encounter. Finally, it was foolishly overpowered. The range was still uncertain but was probably determined by the strength of the attack. And it could not be seen. It was absurdly powerful magic to be able to destroy his purified chakra Rasengan and still make the blonde take off. However, the battle would instantly go in Naruto's favor if he could land a single blow on the opponent. Alternatively, he might win the battle if he lasted an additional 4 minutes. The conditions of Gildart's use of crash magic were still unclear to Naruto. Gray curtly nodded in response to Naruto's small hand signal. With a slightly larger Rasengan already formed in his hand, Naruto threw his kunai and teleported alongside Gildarts. Gildarts used his crash magic to strike the approaching blonde, but the blonde vanished once more. Gildarts thought, his other clone threw another one of those blades? Out of surprise. Reaching forward with his Chu Udama Rasengan, giant spiraling sphere, Naruto materialized behind the mage. With his other hand, Gildarts shot out, but Gray was ready. To keep too much damage from happening, the ice mage formed a shield in front of the blonde. Only a half-second passed before the crash magic finally broke through the strong ice shield, but that was more than enough time for Naruto to flash once more, this time appearing directly above the mage. Naruto yelled, "Take this," as his enormous golden Rasengan swiftly descended from above the great mage. The enormous spiraling sphere started to vanish as its matter was swiftly destroyed, but Naruto's attack stopped an inch from Gildart's head. Before being struck by the crash magic, Naruto flashed away. Large pieces of rock fell from the room's roof onto the ice floor when Gildart's attack struck the ceiling, but the floor held firm. Naruto exhaled with relief. The blonde's scheme would have been thwarted if Gildarts had noticed what his clones were doing beneath that floor. The S-class mage would not have permitted the blonde to proceed. To gain distance, Naruto leapt back a few meters and came to a stop when he was once more beside Gray. Naruto remarked, "Your magic is overpowered, you know that?" Gildarts laughed. Naruto grinned and said, "Didn't you say that your seals can do anything?" Before vanishing in a flash, traveling fast enough to materialize in front of Gildarts. The blonde started to sense Gildart's magic rise, and his smirk grew. The blonde said, "Yes, I did," and then she produced a seal. Gray and Gildarts were unable to see the blonde because of the sudden appearance of a circular barrier made of flaming fires and violent wind. Gildarts had put up a crash barrier as a precaution, and Naruto collided with it. The S-class mage boosted his barrier's strength to push the blonde away, but he was taken aback when Naruto's barrier persisted in its struggle for supremacy against Gildart's barrier. Gildarts was unaware that the blonde was holding another seal inside Naruto's barrier, which was gradually consuming the crash magic barrier. Naruto had used the same seal to absorb the fire dragon's roar from the Dragon Slayer in order to harm Natsu. Gray materialized behind his opponent and raised both of his hands before lowering them, as though he were telekinetically controlling something, while Gildarts was concentrating on the blonde's round flaming barrier, which had a searing heat. Water droplets materialized in the air and then froze, and suddenly there were ice needles in the air. "Ice make 1,000 needles of death," exclaimed Gray. At a high speed, thousands of needles rushed toward the S-class mage, each one traveling so fast that it was nearly imperceptible. Gildarts hardly had time to strengthen his barrier once more before the needles began to pierce it, each one stopping just a few inches from the S-class mage's body. Gildarts mused to himself, "I should boost my power to 10%. They're a surprisingly good tag team." But Gray continued to unleash a torrent of magic, reducing the Ice Mage's magic reserves considerably in the process. The piercing projectiles became large, sharp, edged glaciers rather than needles. "Ice Make. Glacier Barrage," Gildarts exclaimed, his eyes widening in anticipation of the impending onslaught. With his palms facing the approaching glaciers, he raised his hands in the air. But Naruto's flaming barrier vanished as he flashed directly in front of the hands. Naruto grinned and held up another seal tag. Gildarts thought to himself, "What is he doing? The glaciers are going to hit him." He didn't even mind that the blonde was also the target of his crash magic. The letters on the paper glowed brightly when the crash magic touched the seal in the blonde's fingers. Then Gildart's attack, which destroyed matter, started to seep into the paper. Just in time, Naruto flashed aside and appeared beside Gray as he sensed his seal was about to expire. Gildarts had just been hit by Gray's onslaught of jagged glaciers. The room echoed with a tremendous boom, but because the floor was made of ice, no dust rose. However, a few tiny rock fragments dropped from the ceiling, causing the enormous room to tremble a little. Naruto was relieved to see that the ice floor had not yet broken completely. The impact had only penetrated halfway through the floor. He also noticed that the Gildarts were not at the location where the glaciers had struck. As he and Gray searched for Gildarts, Naruto kept counting down the seconds that remained. Just another 2 minutes. Just have to hold on to this battle for 1 minute and 4 seconds. 50. 3. 50.2. When a clap echoed, the two boys' hunt for Gildarts came to an end. When the two turned to investigate the source of the noise, they saw Gildarts clapping. The magic level of Gildarts started to rise. "Congratulations. You two forced me to move." So, then a pillar of light burst from the mage, and it exploded. Gray was being choked by the magical pressure, but Naruto was standing erect and maintaining his focus with ease because he was accustomed to high pressure. Naruto thought, somewhat surprised, but the amount he's releasing is enough to challenge two level shinobis combined. But when he lifted his hands and clapped them together, the blonde's grin widened. "Sage mode!" exclaimed Naruto. All at once, the blonde's chakra rose to Gildart's level, surpassing the man's. The blonde had a strange orange makeup around his eyes, and Gray noticed that his eyes were now golden with a bar-like thing that ran horizontally across the pupil. However, Gildart's magic levels exploded once more, increasing exponentially, and Naruto's dominance in magic levels came to an abrupt end. Naruto swore in his own voice. Naruto lowered himself to a low position, bending his knees and placing both hands by his sides. "Damn it! I can't use an incomplete Kyuubi chakra mode with Sage mode. They'll both just shut down. Okay, I'm going to have to gamble this. Then 4 clones, devoid of seals, materialized beside the blonde and started massaging the air above her hand. Naruto shouted adamantly, I can't hold this form for too long, so let's see whose attack is stronger. In response, Gildarts raised both of his hands and directed his crash magic into his palms, laughing aloud as he seemed to be the devil himself with his current strength. He wouldn't go all out with the blonde, but he could see which was stronger, the blonde's strongest attack or one of his strongest when he was at 50%. Once more, Naruto's chakra levels rose. It wouldn't deplete all of his chakra, but it would reduce him to 20% or less. The clones started to rub the air more frequently, their hands blurring as they did so. Then, a golden spinning Rasengan materialized in both of Naruto's hands, and a screeching sound filled the air. It was rubbed by the clones until it reached the size of a whole Rasen Shuriken. Naruto added more chakra to his attack, drawing on both his reserves and his recently activated magic reserves. But I'm not done yet, he exclaimed. The thing about magic is that it doesn't require any kind of affinity to use any of the elements better. Rather, all that was needed was training, which Naruto was very good at. As the sounds of the screeching bells grew louder and louder, Naruto roared and added fire to his growing Rasen Shuriken, which was spinning at unbelievable speeds. Gray was on his knees from the strain, his hands over his ears as he gazed at the 2 competing mages in utter awe and powerlessness. The 2 were applying such absurd pressure that he was barely able to remain conscious. Gray looked at Naruto, the blonde smirking directly at Gildarts, whose attack was also getting stronger as the crash magic actually started to show. This is what S-class mages can do. I can't even hold a candle to Gildarts, I knew that, but was Naruto always this strong? He asked. Gray had to leap away from the absurd heat generated by Naruto's spinning attack when he added fire to his wind style, Rasen Shuriken. Below the blonde, the ice started to melt incredibly quickly. The blonde then took an absurd action. Naruto raised both fire and wind style Rasen Shuriken over his head and combined them when the 4 clones vanished after they were finished. The attack, which spanned nearly 20 meters, quadrupled in size and intensified. Even though Gray had strengthened the ice beneath the blonde and was working to stop it from melting anymore, the ice was now melting even more quickly. This is my best shot. Nearly 20 itmes more destructive and powerful than my regular wind style Rasen Shuriken. With my purified potent golden chakra and fire added to wind, let's see how strong you really are, Gildarts. Naruto yelled, take this, as he started to wind up to throw his current masterpiece, a huge chakra, taxing ability. With a roar, Gildarts released his crash magic, which was now breaking the ice and gradually eroding the entire battlefield. The sides and ceiling were crumbling rock. Gildarts then unleashed his attack, causing the ice to crack and shatter wherever it went as the visible crash attack zoomed in Naruto's direction. With Rasen Shuriken at the end of his fingers, Naruto was throwing in the fire and wind style. Naruto muttered, just kidding, as a Naruto clone with a massive paper seal materialized in front of the blonde. After he created the first 1,000 clones, he created 2 more for this purpose. While the other would draw up his strongest absorption seal, the first would gather natural energy. This time, Gildarts' expression was one of uncontrollable shock as one of his strongest skills was gradually drained into the seal. Your 5 minutes are up, Gildarts. You will lose because you underestimated me, and I've always wanted to say this line at least once. As the entire floor was destroyed, Naruto leapt off the ice floor and used the fake throw to flip in order to keep his new Rasen Shuriken. Because of the color of his chakra, thousands of clones were revealed, all of them flying in Gildarts' direction with a typical golden Rasengan. However, the monster's crash magic eliminated them all. Naruto yelled, you're within my field of divination. Gildarts realized what Naruto meant all of a sudden. There was an absurdly long and intricate seal that covered the entire space beneath the shattered ice floor and on the actual rock room floor, and it was starting to glow a vivid blue. What kind of rune is that? How did he manage to make something so complicated within 5 minutes? Gildarts pondered. But the blonde was now going all out, and he was still holding back. With his deadly Kinjutsu, which is capable of destroying mountains at full power, Gildarts focused on the last blonde in the air. But at the moment, his chakra and control were limited to making one powerful enough to demolish a small hill. However, it would be nearly as powerful as his Biju Rasen Shuriken in a few years. Naruto was eager to incorporate fire into that attack. Then, quickly, Naruto vanished and reappeared behind Gildarts. With the Kinjutsu, the blonde hurled it at his opponent. When Gildarts noticed this, he quickly raised his crash barrier to the maximum level in the brief time it took for the powerful attack based on magic and chakra to reach him. When it did, Gildarts was barely able to stop it, but he was still using his magic to render the attack ineffective. But when Naruto saw this, he grinned. I made the core slightly unstable so that if it was even barely tampered with. In an instant, the Naruto clone vanished and materialized on one of the glowing seals directly in front of Gildarts, avoiding the majority of the man's barrier in a single motion. Then, in spite of the damage it had sustained, the clone forced its way through the remaining barrier and punched Gildarts in the chest and face, causing nearly no damage. A seal was placed on the S-class mage, the fire and wind style. Rasen Shuriken exploded, creating a massive dome of circling fire and wind with millions of chakra needles, and Gildarts was in the center of it. The clone had also succeeded in pushing Gildarts closer to the center of the unstable attack. Coughing and heaving violently, Naruto skidded across the stone floor as he flew backwards from the explosion's impact. His chakra was only at 11% after the attack had nearly depleted it, and he could feel the Iterano in the air starting to replenish his magic reserves. The dome vanished after 30 seconds of non-stop screeching and devastation, revealing a gasping Gildarts. But the man was completely unscratched, which caused Naruto to frown. The blonde pushed off his legs, his body creaking and aching as he got off his stomach. Naruto gasped, I'm definitely going to beat you. Gray's eyes were wide as he observed Naruto. Naruto was going all out for the first time, something he had never witnessed before. The blonde's eyes had turned back to blue, but they were so fiery and determined that they resembled Natsu's. Naruto said, I may be low on my reserves, but you're still within the range of my divination. As he abruptly vanished and flashed to one of the seals on the ground in front of Gildarts. During those 5 minutes, Naruto had created a massive Hiraishin seal that covered the entire floor, enabling him to flash to any location in the room as long as he had chakra remaining in his body. In quick succession, Naruto threw 2 tags, a gravity seal after the barrier absorption seal. The gravity seal failed to reach the mage, floating in midair in front of the man, while the first seal succeeded in breaching the man's marginally weaker barrier. Katsu! Exclaimed Naruto. The gravity seal exploded as it suddenly started to spark. As a precaution, Naruto had infused the seal with an explosive tag. The blonde fell backward onto the floor, lowering himself to his knees. It was absurdly taxing on Naruto's reserves to create something akin to the fire and wind style. Rasen Shuriken on both hands, combine them, and maintain it for roughly 20 seconds. The blonde hit the ground on his back, his head bouncing a little. The blonde then simply gazed at the stone room's ceiling. Gay, I guess I lost, huh? Gildarts remained silent and still, gazing up at the blonde's prone form. Makarov was right, to be able to force me to go up to 50%, this kid will be a monster in the future. No doubt, he'll be the ace of fairy tale in just a few years. Hell, in 10 years, I'll say he'll be at a level of his own, Gildarts thought to himself. His words were, you passed the second trial. When Gray heard this, he was astonished and yelled for the blonde with joy and delight. That was not what he expected. In contrast, Naruto had a little more exam-related experience. A person could still become a Chunin if they received enough upvotes to be given the rank, even if they lost or failed the Chunin exams. When Naruto heard Gray's exclamation of joy, he laughed. Gray exclaimed, Naruto, you did it! Hell yeah! As he rushed around the room, yelling and cheering uncontrollably after suddenly regaining all of his energy. After struggling to stand and falling to his knees, Naruto flashed to the location of one of his absorption seals, which had absorbed Gildart's most potent blow during a sort of standoff between the two. Grabbing it, Naruto slapped it to his chest. Though it would take some time for it to transform into the pure, golden chakra, he could already feel the magic entering his body and changing back into chakra. As Naruto's reserves increased from less than 8% to almost 30% and continued to rise, he let out a sigh of relief. Naruto laughed and said, you're one crazy kid, you know that? In response, he said, I'm unpredictable. After giving a little snort, Gildarts gestured toward one of the walls. Naruto noticed another passage where his finger was pointed. That is the final part of this test. This one is actually kind of a bonus. No one has ever been able to get to the end of the passage. Well, I never tried it, but something tells me not to go in there for some reason. Anyways, if you find what's down there, tell us, alright? We have Lacrima cameras set up in certain spots of that passage to tell us how far you got, Gildarts said as he made his way back to the surface. Gildarts grabbed Gray as he started to approach Naruto. Gray sighed and turned to leave with Gildarts, a little let down that he couldn't continue with the blonde. I don't think so. This last part is difficult enough that I even have to say high A-class mages are up only. But a wonderful thought occurred to Gray. and he started to smile. He could boast to Natsu about this. How eager he was to simply thrust this in the Dragonslayer's face. Naruto observed them leaving. He turned and gazed at the open passage after they had vanished from his view. In contrast to what Gildarts claimed about himself, something was calling him forward and pulling him in the direction of whatever was at the end of the passage. As soon as Naruto moved forward and entered the cave, earth spikes and shadows appeared out of nowhere. Naruto barely avoided in time as he made a clone and used it to replace himself. The clone, though, was unpierced. The blonde was about to be impaled through his body when, for some reason, the spikes and shadow spears stopped. Wait, shadow spear. Naruto sprinted down the passageway, turning away from the entrance. The blonde was caught in a number of traps along the way, but they all halted before launching a deadly attack that included a fireball, a lightning strike, a dozen kunais, shurikens, and numerous other weapons. Naruto accelerated his pace each time the traps rained down on him. Almost hundreds of the traps later. It can't be, but when the passage came to an end, Naruto entered another enormous, spacious room. In contrast to the room where Naruto had battled Gildarts, this room was filled with boxes, and in the middle of them were 5 books and a rectangle of clear crystal glass that held a single item. A headband featuring the hidden leaf symbol. It took Naruto nearly a minute to get to the glass and 5 books as he stumbled forward. Tears filled his eyes as he saw what they had all said. The Diary of Sarutobi Konohamaru. A Day in the Life of Kakashi Hatake. The Background of Shikamaru Nara. The Fourth Great Shinobi War's History. A story of a completely brave ninja. When Naruto reached for Shikamaru's history, he noticed that one of the pages had a bookmark. Its initial statement was, "Dragons and Magic." Naruto was immediately interested. He started reading and discovered that magic had somehow made its way into the elemental nation's world. The Nara wrote a thorough analysis and explanation of how magic came into the world in an entirely non-Shikamaru moment of lack of laziness, but it was primarily a theory. But as Naruto continued to turn the pages, he discovered that Shikamaru wasn't the only Nara who had worked on it. The handwriting changed as he proceeded with his research. But this was what he grasped at a glance. When magic first emerged, it was regarded as a recreational activity because it was deemed odd and an esoteric ability because there was so little Itorano in the atmosphere. The 10% rule, which states that only around 10% of people can be mages, is a small percentage when combined with the current facts. But when a few mages used their rune magic to vanquish the tailed beasts and transform their chakra into magic, it spread and gained popularity. As a result, magical beasts were created and Itorano spread throughout the atmosphere. The highest tier of magical beasts that emerged from the transformation of the tailed beasts were dragons, which were basically the product of magic. The landscape started to change as a result of the massive inflow of magical energy. As time went on, the world changed. A map of the elemental nations appeared on the following page. Although the world was exactly the same size, Naruto saw that it was entirely different from Earthland. For Naruto, this meant that he had passed through time without entering a different dimension. His ears rang with Kurama's words again. Bijus like us cannot leave dimensions. We would mess up timelines and create huge paradoxes, which you would have known if you had actually carefully read your father's notes about space, time techniques. The fact that you are even able to leave with your status as Jinchuriki is strange by itself. In fact, there are already changes being made to your body. The time paradox would have been too big, though, and he hadn't passed through to another dimension. In the real world, the time he had spent spinning around those circular gates could have been many years, hundreds of years, or even 1,000 years for each minute he was there. He would never know, anyway. All he knew was that the ninja era had given way to the mage era thousands of years ago. He was never able to enter a different dimension in the first place, and now he had reached the point where he would produce the least paradox. How could the books still be clean and readable? Simple? Seals. The blonde's thoughts briefly infuriated her. Then why would Kurama not be able to stay with me? Why couldn't I stay in my dimension, Kami? I didn't even leave the dimension. Wait. Paradoxes. This whole world may be an alternate universe by itself that I don't know about. Reaching for another book, Naruto opened Konohamaru's. Naruto flipped through a few pages before stopping at one that had a folded corner and seemed significant. Naruto ni.san. Guess what? I made Jonin today. Kakashi, the 6th Hokage, even congratulated me. Isn't that great? Well, I know you're not here anymore, but I feel that someday you'll hear me. As he read Konohamaru's diary, Naruto's eyes began to well up with tiny drops of tears. It doesn't feel right that I got the position without fighting you for it. We were rivals, remember? I was supposed to beat you up for the position and take it from your hands. he exclaimed after learning that Konohamaru had become the 7th Hokage of Konoha. In order to seal all of the boxes into a sizable storage scroll, Naruto made hundreds of clones and sealed all of the books onto his skin. Naruto glanced at the headband, the only item left in the center of the room, as they worked on that. He owned it. He was aware of it. He had lost it in the battle with Madara, but he knew exactly where the drops of blood were. The scratch mark on the corner was familiar to him. 5 lines of text were placed on top of the crystal case. The hero's final possession from the 4th Great Shinobi War. His early years were marked by a lack of affection and respect. Additionally, he passed away too soon to ever be respected in his later years. The Kyuubi, the Jinchuriki of the strongest tailed beasts. Naruto Uzumaki. Namikaze was this man. Naruto gazed at the words on the ancient, tattered, and worn scroll. Before he sealed it into his skin with the books, he reached for it and held it carefully. His treasures would be these. What about the headband? Gripping it, Naruto brought it to his forehead and tied it once more while blinking away his tears. Naruto gave the cave that once contained all of his past one final glance. Then he pivoted so that he was looking directly at the rectangular crystal box that had contained his headband once more. To write a Hiraishin seal on the box in case someone else survived all the death traps and discovered the cave, only to discover nothing there, the blonde made a clone. However, Naruto now understood a few things. The tall cliffs, protruding rocks, and the island's enormous trees all pointed to one location that Naruto was familiar with: Konoha. The blonde now realized why the trees were attempting to steal some of his chakra as he approached the island. Additionally, he realized that the 8 rocks represented the 8 Hokages. But the blonde started asking more questions. How, for instance, did chakra relate to magic? Do the 2 energies have some connection, or are they entirely distinct? Furthermore, when he was still holding back, how did Gildarts release more pressure than 2 cages combined? Was it because his reserves were so high, or was the man simultaneously catching and releasing the Itorano in the air? The blonde sensed that it was a little bit of both. After Gildarts released his magic, it felt much denser than regular Itorano, suggesting that magic could be made more potent, much like Naruto's golden chakra. But still, to lose that badly, that guy is a monster. When I'm 18 again, I know I'll have maybe 3 or 4 times more chakra than he. But to be able to have such high reserves and density without chakra is amazing at the least. Well, at least I know something else now too. I will never be as strong as Kurama on my base stats. Even now, if I went into incomplete Kyuubi chakra mode, I'd probably still lose against Gildarts. Of course, after I complete Kyuubi chakra mode, Biju mode, and complete Biju mode, I'll be stronger than him, but still, I have to give that guy a lot of credit. He's stronger than a majority of the ninjas of the old, huh? Naruto thought to himself. Then he let out a sigh. The battle with Gildarts was almost 30 minutes ago, and he had been gone for too long. The blonde then vanished in a flash of orange. Where? Boat? Gildarts was discussing a certain blonde mage who competed in the S-class trials with Makarov in private a few minutes prior to Naruto flashing onto the boat beside Gray. Makarov inquired curiously, "So, how did it go? Did you find something interesting about Naruto-chan?" Gildarts decided to get his questions answered before answering, so he asked, "How old did you say Naruto was again?" Just standing in a corner of the boat, gazing out at the island, were the 2 strong mages. The elderly master stood on the handrail, and the taller mage leaned against the edge. Makarov questioned, "He's only 13. Why, you don't believe him?" Gildarts gave a slow shake of his head. "Physically, yes. Mentally, I don't. The way he analyzes and plans, even in battle, is way too advanced for his age. He checked his surroundings, always had backup plan, and had a response for every situation. In order to think the way he does, he would have to have experience, something a 13-year-old should not have. And every attack he used on me was with the intent to kill, knowing that I am currently stronger than he is. I'd say in a few years, he'll be on a level of his own, higher than both you and I." Makarov hummed to himself, taking in everything he fresh knowledge. Hearing Gildarts' evaluation of the blonde was novel to him as master, who had also never witnessed Naruto go all out. However, the Ace of Fairy Tales' prediction that Naruto would catch up to him in a few years was a huge compliment to the blonde. The master pondered for a few moments before deciding that he needed to know more before drawing any conclusions. Gildarts nodded in response to the question. Did he show anything strange or different in his abilities? His magic reserves are extremely high and also very potent for his age. He's definitely high S-class simply from magic reserves. He has almost half of what I have, but his magic is much denser for some reason, at least twice as dense. Also, I think I have reason to believe that he is not only able to use fire, but also lightning when he used it in small bursts to speed up his movements and reactions. His strongest ability was a between pure magic manipulation, wind, and fire. I think he called it fire and wind style. Rasen Shuriken. It forced me to bring up my barrier up to 50% until it exploded. That technique he used is at a whole new level, said, shivering at the thought could develop further. Makarov was taken aback. The blonde had to be a battle genius or ridiculously strong to raise Gildarts to 50% or more. But Makarov, who knew the blonde, soon realized it was a combination of the two. Gildarts wasn't finished yet, though. Finally, he used something called Sage Mode. I don't know what the details are but. Did you say Sage Mode? Makarov exclaimed, his voice barely audible above a whisper, in shock. Gildarts gave a nod, but his brows were lifted in perplexity. Makarov's expression turned grave as he looked directly at the island where Naruto was still. I believe so. Why? He asked. I've had my thoughts and doubts about something, but now I'm almost certain. Before magic, there was something called chakra, which was the mixture between the physical and spiritual energies of the person. You knew this, right? Good. In the past, mages were able to use both chakra and magic, but as time passed, people began to focus more and more on the magic side because it had none of the downfalls that chakra had. For example, we wouldn't die from chakra exhaustion. Eventually, chakra users died off, and now all people use magic. Makarov held up his hand to halt Gildarts, asking, what does this have to do with Naruto? Let me finish my explanation. The reason why our reserves are much denser than the Itorano in the air is because in a way, we evolved in energy usage. The magic we use have some properties of chakra. We have all the good and none of the bad. Our magic reserves are high because Itorano is light and we can hold tons of it, but we can make it denser as well as more potent, increasing the power of our abilities. If magic didn't have this small trait, chakra would most likely still be in use in small quantities today. However, chakra is about just as dense as magic today. Gildarts briefly interrupted the elderly gentleman. Makarov sighed and chose to simplify things for Gildarts, saying, I want to know why you're so surprised. I don't need a history lesson, old man. You said that his magic reserves are much denser than yours even though that he is much younger. Also, not only is he able to use pure magic manipulation, but he is also able to use ancient runes. I had my suspicions, but I believe I'm correct. Naruto may be able to use chakra and magic like people in the past were able to, Makarov said. Gildart's jaw dropped and his eyes widened in surprise. His sage clothes flapping as he landed on his feet. Naruto flashed onto the boat beside Gray before he could reply. The blonde had a big sealing scroll on her back. The metal forehead protector, a peculiar symbol in the center that appeared surprisingly natural on the blonde, was the most obvious alteration. What's up with the scroll and the headband, Naruto? Gray responded. Grinning, Naruto turned to face the ice mage. Gray smiled back and gave Naruto a back pat before turning to Makarov. This is what I found all the way inside the tunnel. Spoils of victory, haha. Makarov grinned and nodded, saying, hey, master. This means that Naruto is now an S-class mage, right? Naruto laughed and scratched the back of his head while Gray yelled with joy for his blonde friend. As the two boys were occupied with being happy, Makarov and Gildarts reverted to their solemn looks while gazing at the blonde, who was the only one to pass this year's S-class trials. Due to the fact that neither of their opponents passed the second part of the exam, Freed and Evergreen were disqualified. Makarov narrowed his eyes at Naruto, not out of mistrust but rather a hint of suspicion. The boy's loyalty to Fairy Tail and his friends was undeniable. However, the master was troubled by one thing. It had nothing to do with the blonde's strength or strategic acumen. What are you hiding, Naruto? 5 hours of time skip. One of the guild members yelled, they're back, as he dashed through the doors. Every member of the guild instantly got up and faced the doors, waiting for the mages who had traveled to the island to enter. A shadow appeared after an intense wait of almost 30 seconds. The door then started to open. Every member waited, leaning forward. Every time the blonde got bored, Natsu, who thought the door was opening too slowly, rushed forward, leapt to his feet, and yelled out one of Naruto's troll techniques. Dynamic entry. Natsu came closer and closer to the door, his foot catching fire. Then it opened, revealing Naruto standing just a few inches from Natsu's foot. The two boys simultaneously said, eh? Everyone's time seemed to slow down. While Naruto's face displayed shock and surprise at the foot that was getting close to his face, Natsu's face displayed bewilderment. Naruto asked himself, why does this feel familiar? Oh yay, guy kicked arrow. Senin once. normalcy was restored, and then... Act. Natsu kicked the blonde in the face, sending Naruto flying backwards. It appeared to the returning guild members outside that Naruto simply opened the guild door, flew backwards, and collided with a building wall across the street. As he stood sideways on the wall, completely defying gravity, Naruto muttered, "Natsu, I'm upping your seals when we train tomorrow, loud enough for everyone to hear." In midair, he had flipped rapidly, following the kick's momentum. As the blonde walked down the wall, everyone else just stared in disbelief. But since they had watched him train and heard his explanation of the powers of pure magic manipulation, Natsu, Gray, and Kana were already accustomed to it. Hell, he had even demonstrated to them that if he put a little energy into his feet, he could walk on water. Upon hearing this, Natsu directed his fire toward his feet and discovered that, if he managed the flame's propulsion, he could truly fly. Natsu's face went pale as he whimpered, "Please, don't increase my seals. It's already heavy enough." In an attempt to stop the blonde from making the pink-haired Dragonslayer's training more challenging, the Dragonslayer rushed over to Naruto and circled the blonde while talking quickly. Natsu grunted indignantly as he fell to the ground face first after Naruto simply ignored him and slapped the Dragonslayer with a level 8 gravity seal. Naruto proceeded, but he paused at the guild's entrance and uttered the following. "Don't you want to be an S-class like me, though?" Naruto asked, turning his head just enough for Natsu to see the blonde's sly smile. Along with every other guild member who was unaware of this fact, Natsu's face widened in surprise and showed obvious shock before he grinned and got up. Natsu said, "Of course I do. You're not getting away from me," as he pushed himself to stand up from his knees. When Naruto turned around after nodding his head, a seemingly inebriated Kana gobbled him up, the brunette putting her arms firmly around the blonde's waist. Kana spoke slowly and slurred, "Naruto, congratulations, and what's with the headband and huge, gigantic scroll on top of your butt?" The blonde's back arched in agony and he was hilariously choking instead of answering. Before glaring at Naruto, Kana looked up and gazed at his blue face for a while. Naruto groaned back, causing bubbles to form in his mouth. Aren't you supposed to say thanks or something? And you didn't answer my question." Holy crap, she has a lot of magic reserves. Naruto thought to himself, why the hell is she adding so much magic into her hug? To lessen the pain of Kana's death hug, Naruto focused his chakra around his body. The blonde then smiled at the slightly shorter girl, looking down on her. Kana nodded drunkenly and smiled. "Thank you, Kana. The headband and scroll is something I found." Afterward, Naruto's face appeared to turn ghoulish and shadowed, mimicking Captain Yamato's spectral appearance when he had intended to frighten Naruto. "But didn't I say you can't drink?" Natsu gulped in horror and started to backpedal away from the blonde as he turned his head to face him. "And you, Natsu, you just watched her drink, correct?" Natsu made no movement in response. Rather, he started applying more pressure to the wall of the building across from the guild building. Taking this as confirmation, Naruto scowled at the young Dragonslayer. "When we train again, I'm showing you hell," he stated. Naruto smirked ferociously for a moment, releasing a tiny bit of killing intent. A makeshift crimson fox with 9 tails appeared above the blonde, smirking and smiling maliciously, and many of the guild members retreated from him as they saw him start to laugh a little crazily. The illusion vanished as soon as Kana staggered and shoved Naruto to the guild hall's wooden floor. Naruto simply sighed in frustration when the master in Guildarts, among other guild members, let out loud catcalls. In addition to being too lazy to get up, he was still a little worn out from the S-class trials. Furthermore, he didn't want to push her off of his body and then lift her up. No, he will only do that for Urza and Mira because he always ends up dropping them with gravity seals, leaving them on the ground after their little skirmishes. Then again, they are starting to get used to the heavier ones since they're constantly exposed to the gravity seals. Maybe I should increase the level next time? He waited for Kana to leave his body while the blonde was thinking, only to discover a few moments later that she had fainted from excessive intoxication. In frustration, Naruto closed his eyes and made the decision to sit up, picking her up by the waist. He muttered to himself as he stood up with Kana on his shoulder, her face near his. "Yeah, and you're going to start training with us, too," Naruto muttered to the unconscious brunette, who had no idea what the following day would bring. Makarov said from the door, "Naruto, where are you going?" The blonde turned to face the guild master and gestured to the girl who was unconscious on his shoulder. "I'm taking her to the infirmary or at least to one of the rooms inside the guild. She's going to have a massive headache when she wakes up. We can't start our party without you. After all, since you were the only person that made S-class this year, you have to be here for the whole party." Naruto turned to face the other mages, who were grinning and looking a little surprised. Ursa and Mira were staring at him with grudging respect for not only being the youngest ever S-Class mage of all time, but also being the only person to become S-Class in Fairy Tail's trials for the year. All of the older guild members, including Natsu, Gray, Levi, and her two bodyguard friends, were grinning at the blonde and extending an invitation to join them. After completing a full circle, Naruto faced the master once more and uttered the following. He threw a kunai through one of the open doors leading up to guild rooms, and the blonde quickly vanished after saying, "No thanks. I'm not a party person." The guild building shook as Makarov and several other members' face faulted on the ground. Naruto laughed as he heard many of his fellow guild members yell, "How the hell do you not party? We are Fairy Tail," inside the building, but when he claimed that he wasn't into partying, he wasn't lying. After defeating Pain, he received the biggest reception of his life, but even that was fleeting and not truly a celebration. When the blonde was younger, Naruto had only celebrated his birthday when he and Jiraiya were out of town because he was constantly harassed by the villagers. Regretfully, he spent his later years training and battling S-Class ninjas, followed by Madara and Obito Uchiha. No, Naruto wasn't really into going out to parties. He was okay with small parties and get-togethers, but going all out to party didn't seem to suit him. When Naruto heard the telltale signs of another of Fairy Tail's frequent bar fights, which were probably started by Natsu, he laughed once more. He was aware that whether or not he attended the celebration, the guild would still celebrate and eventually start fighting. With a sigh of satisfaction, Naruto laid Kana down on the bed in the room where he had first awoken upon arriving in this future. The blonde was still troubled by the possibility that it was an alternate universe, but Naruto was aware that he could not return to his past. After pushing one of the wooden chairs against the wall beside the bed, Naruto sat on it and gazed around the space, out the window, and finally at Kana, who was soundly dozing off on top of the sheets and covers. Ba, Chan, Shizune, Anko Ne, Chan, all of them drank because they had problems to deal with. Tsunade Ba. Chan saw her fiancé die in the battlefield and was unable to save him despite being the world's most famous medic. Shizune started drinking when Ba. Chan was in a coma and again when the war started. Anko Ne. Chan was tricked by her teacher and took all of the consequences from the villages, taking their hatred in stride by becoming the reckless person she was. So Kana, what kinds of problems are you dealing with right now that made you drink? What aren't you telling me? Naruto asked himself, then he threw back his head and let out a small, humorless laugh that did not match the blonde's usual exuberance at all. Hey, hiding things. That's what I'm doing to this whole guild, just hiding my past, my true abilities, everything. But I still think it's best if I didn't tell anyone, and never have to. If I become strong enough, I'll never have to use my true abilities, and I'll always stay under the radar, like the ninja I actually am. Naruto lowered his head to Kana's sleeping form and watched as she slowly breathed in, out, and back in. But if there's one thing I believe I will do no matter what, it is that I will always follow my Nindo. I will never break my promises, and I promise to you and all of Fairy Tail that in your times of need, I will be there. I will be your support when you need me most. And if I have to, I will reveal all of my secrets. As the day wore on, Kana slept soundly in complete contrast to Naruto's introspective thoughts. The sun was setting over the mountains, creating a stunning sunset, with the light glinting on Naruto's metal forehead protector and reflecting against the window. Time skip. The following morning, Naruto, you're such a slave driver, Kana grumbled as the 13-year-old finished her first set of exercises, panting on the ground. As he performed his handstand push-ups, on top of his kunais, with one finger on top of each circular ring, Naruto turned to face the girl. The blonde's words sent a shiver down Kana's spine, so she wisely shook her head quickly and started her next set. "I'm sorry, did you say something?" she asked. From his position in the forest clearing, honing his ice control skills, Gray questioned, "Aren't you going a bit too hard on her for her first day?" Naruto shook his head without looking over. "We're going to be training like this for a month since you guys are joining me for my S-Class missions. They're supposed to be a couple times harder than regular A-Class missions. We're not going to run into your average run-of-the-mill mages from now on. No, everything from here on out is serious. So if any of you guys get hurt in the missions, it'll be my fault." Natsu, wearing a level 9 gravity seal and performing his set of 500 push-ups. Natsu shouted, "Hell yeah, S-Class missions. I'm so fired up," as he accelerated his physical training. Kana groaned on the ground as she struggled to complete her set of 100 sit-ups, and both Naruto and Gray laughed. As she carried on with her workouts, Kana grunted, "Why am I doing physical exercises in the first place? I mean, I get Natsu working on physical exercises because he's a fighter mage, but Gray isn't doing anything physical. So why me? Naruto started doing sit-ups beside the girl after flipping out of his position next to Kana. Gray's magic is extremely versatile. He can be both a long-distance and close-range fighter with his Ice Make magic. However, you are completely a long-distance fighter with your cards. What would happen if someone was able to close the distance and get close enough to you to make the fight into a close-range battle? With perspiration streaming down his face, Naruto shook his head and asked, "Wouldn't you guys be there to jump in if it happened?" The blonde could appreciate her point of view. In a way, he had thought somewhat similarly during his years of inexperience. Kana performed another sit-up and paused to answer, "Kana, we're not always going to be there to back you up. You need to be able to defend yourself when the time requires it." She gasped, "Then why are we, doing this?" Naruto approached and paused to speak briefly with the weary girl. She had only just begun and had never really trained with them, so it was impressive that she had lasted an hour. Furthermore, it was remarkable that the blonde could complete an hour of her training without engaging in any physical training. Because if you don't, you won't be able to learn or keep up when I begin to teach you the style of fighting I want you to learn. Not only that, but you have to realize that out of the four of us here, you are the most vulnerable if someone gets within close range of you. The rest of us are primarily close to mid-distance fighters, but we also have a form of long-range attacks. However, you are completely mid to long range with almost nothing close range to compensate or round out your skills, said the brunette. Kana wouldn't be able to use the Goken fighting style, but she'll be able to utilize Hinata's style of Juken. It doesn't really require her to attack the Tenketsu points since I'm mainly teaching her for simple close range fighting and defense. Then again, I don't even know if mages have Tenketsu points. Wait, if we're going to be doing this for a month, then what about our missions? How are we going to have enough money to pay for rent and stuff? Also, what about all the requests that are directed towards us since we don't destroy anything? Replied Gray. With a sly smile, Naruto turned away from Kana and faced the Ice Mage. Don't worry. My clones are taking all of the mission requests that are B rank or lower sometime about now. Hehehe. Oh, I'm going to love the reaction of the guild, the brunette laughed. Situated in the guild hall of Fairy Tail. GG.san, I'm going on this mission. Hey. Stamp this one already. GG.san. Hurry up, GG.san. I need to go already. Stamp them all before anyone comes in and sees us. Ursa and Mira aren't getting a single mission today, hell yeah. The bar counter was crowded with almost 100 Naruto clones, each of whom was holding a mission request. When the blonde's clones created a huge commotion and took all of the mission requests from the other guild members, Makarov's eyebrows twitched in annoyance. But instead of speaking, the old master silently stamped each request. There was not a single complaint because it was still too early in the morning and there were no guild members in the building yet. The clones started running out of the guild as soon as they were all stamped. By GG.san. The elderly man finally had enough. Stop calling me GG.san. The clones screamed together as they turned around, stuck out their tongues, and slapped each other's butts before sprinting off once more. Makarov's brows twitched once more before he composed himself and took a big gulp from his mug of alcohol. See you later, GG.san, he said. Cheeky little brats, not giving respect to their elders these days. Signage. Clearing forest. While Natsu smiled joyfully at the prospect of not having to pay his rent, Gray and Kana simply perspired. Yeah, it's going to be just fine. My clones should have taken all the missions on the board, so we'll be fine for the month. At last, the Dragon Slayer would be dead. Free. Don't your clones disappear after a single hit though? Gray inquired. As ice and water clumped together on his palm, the Ice Mage started to raise his hand. With swirling ice that was continuously spinning with spikes, he was attempting to create something akin to Naruto's Rasengan. Gray was instantly captivated by the fire and wind style. Rasen Shuriken's power. Even though Gray had only been using the new ability for a day, he had already made some good progress by creating a swirling ball of ice with tiny spikes at the end, but in terms of damage, it was nothing like Naruto's typical Rasengan. Naruto took several avaricious gulps of water from a bottle that had been sealed in his skin before opening it. He drank nearly half of the bottle before lowering it from his lips and giving it to Kana, who gulped it down and consumed the remainder. The possibility that it was an indirect kiss didn't bother either of them. Kana didn't even consider it because she was too exhausted and thirsty, and Naruto didn't care because he was too old mentally and had already experienced that stage. My normal clones would disperse after a single hit, Naruto stated, but Gray sensed a approaching, however. The Ice Mage thought to himself, close enough. Every clone has another seal on it so that if they run into any kind of trouble that is too big for them, either I or any other clone could join them and help with the situation, Gray let go of his swirling ball of water and ice and exhaled slowly, losing focus. I placed on each of the clones that make every one of them more durable. Then his eyes opened, and he looked at Naruto, who was now leaning against a tree in the forest's shade. Naruto nodded his head and asked, "How will they return to their missions after they help?" It's good that Gray is asking these questions. It means he thinks everything through. Is there something I could teach him? Oh, that would be good. Each of them has one teleportation kunai, so they'll just return to their mission if they drop the kunai before leaving. Anyways, Gray, I want you to try something. Gray raised his eyebrows in curiosity. What's up? Naruto questioned. Can you make a clone of yourself out of ice? For a moment, Gray stared up at the sky, reflecting. Gray looked back down and started adjusting the air's humidity in an attempt to create a clone after there had been a pause of about 30 seconds, save for Natsu shouting about S-class missions while he was working on his sets. As the block of ice started to take on the shape of a human, Naruto and Kana observed with curiosity. The ice then gradually started to define itself, starting to resemble Gray more and more. Kana was too exhausted to remain motionless, so Naruto clapped his hands. Good job, Gray. Gray gasped from effort. It took far more energy than he had anticipated to create a single clone. At the moment, the Ice Mage was hunched over, his hands resting on his knees. Gray smiled at the blonde as he turned his head. Yeah, I guess I can make it without color, but I don't know how to move it. Gray nodded and concentrated on the ice clone. Move the ice in the body. Just control it like a puppet. Nothing happened for a second. Subsequently, the clone's finger twitched, and the arm jerked upward, reaching the neck. The clone then broke apart and dropped to the ground in several blocks of ice. Gray, who was breathing heavily again, said, "That takes a lot more control and concentration than I thought it would." Gray nodded and fell to the ground, sitting cross-legged. If you improve your control and concentration, it'll get easier. You might only be able to create one, and they might not have a conscience like mine do, but they'll be as strong and as fast as you can make them. 3 of the 4 were now lounging under a tree's shade and enjoying the sounds of the forest in silence. S-class missions. S-class missions. Oh man, I'm so fired up. All except Natsu, that is, time skip, 1 month. The 4 of them had been training non-stop for a month, though one of them would liken it more to torture than actual training. The only person who struggled during the entire month was Kana. Gray concentrated more on his magic reserves and control. Natsu had already adapted to Naruto's rigorous training schedule and kept up. But Naruto was confident that she could protect herself from a B-class mage in hand combat. Because of Kana's remarkable adaptability, Hinata's Juken style fit in quite nicely. In addition, Kana had borrowed some of Naruto's unpredictable qualities, but not nearly as much as Naruto or Natsu. When Naruto recalled the guild's reaction to his stealing every mission, he laughed to himself. One of Naruto's clones claimed that everyone in the guild had freaked out. After searching the entire town for the blonde, Urza and Mira screamed bloody murder and discovered nothing but sporadic clones that burst into paint in their faces. Naturally, this only served to increase the 2 girls' ire. They were covered in paint of every hue by the end of the day. Even though Urza had used all of her armor, she had less paint on her body at the end of the day than Mira, who was completely covered in rainbow hues. In order to ensure that Naruto didn't hog all of the missions after that day, the guild always had at least 2 members in the morning. Although it was really odd, Urza and Mira went on missions together primarily so they could hunt down the blonde together and beat her up after each mission. Unfortunately for them, clones always pulled practical jokes on them. When Naruto opened the guild's doors, he saw Levi and her 2 partners sitting at a table close to the mission board, obviously tired and sleepy. Naruto smiled at the younger girl as he passed her on his way down the guild. "Good morning, Levi." "Chan!" exclaimed the blonde. Levi simply groaned, lowered her head to the table, and feigned snoring. The blue-haired girl said, "I'm so tired. This is all your fault, Naruto," without enthusiasm. Naruto laughed and proceeded to the 2nd floor, where all of the S-class missions were located. When the blonde had walked up the steps, he saw Laxus sitting on a couch, silently listening to his headphones. Despite maintaining eye contact, neither of them spoke. Then they turned away from one another, both grunting. Since he was best friends with Sasuke, a Uchiha with a stick up his ass 10 feet deep, Naruto was aware of how people like Laxus behaved. Naruto stared at the board for a few minutes, staring at every request and going through all of the information. After removing the tick and grabbing the request, Naruto jumped off the 2nd floor and landed in front of the bar counter after finding a mission that he thought would be interesting and feasible for his current team. "I'll take this mission, GG.san." Makarov grunted as he took a drink from his cup of beer and stared at the mission request before stamping it. Makarov set down his beer, glanced up at the blonde, and said, before Naruto turned around. Naruto grinned and gave the old master the thumbs up, asking, "Are you sure your team is ready to deal with a dark guild?" The blonde turned around and left the building to join his team after saying, "I know what my team can handle, don't worry." The blonde walked away, and Makarov stared. The elderly man sighed after that. He was worried even though he knew Naruto and his group would be alright. He was a parent to every child in the guild prior to becoming a guild master. Time skip. 2 hours. The four were sitting on their knees, gazing at the rather large building in the center of the clearing, and they said, "Okay, before we begin our mission, understand that we cannot make any mistakes." The building's color and shape practically shouted, "I'm a dark guild." Seriously, why the hell would a dark guild choose the middle of a clearing for their base? Probably the worst decision they could have made. They made this mission a couple times easier. There are no civilians to get in the way. This guild has around 40 mages, but the majority is cannon fodder. Most of them are only C-class or B-class mages. There are only 2 A-ranked mages inside that building. Leave them to me, understood? Naruto said with a firm voice. When Naruto went into serious mode, none of the 3 wanted to question the blonde, and normally Natsu would have complained and asked to fight at least one of the A-class mages. Naruto nodded his head and remarked when none of them asked the blonde any questions. Before leaping from his position and crashing through the door of the Dark Guild's building, Naruto said, "Commence the mission. Only rule, do not kill." The air was instantly filled with irate cries as Naruto easily defeated most of the dark mages, freeing them up for Natsu, Gray, and Kana. Naruto leapt high into the air as wind, lightning, and water started to spin around his hand as several mages circled around the blonde and jumped at him as one. Storm style. Kami's fist. A massive explosion shook the structure, sending all 7 of the approaching mages flying backwards and crashing into the guild walls, causing a great deal of smoke and dust. As another dark mage leapt at him with his fist outstretched, Naruto fell to the ground, his expression apathetic. Naruto remarked to himself, "Kami, these mages are so slow, even with my gravity and resistance seals." With lightning, water, and wind swirling around the blonde's hand, Naruto ducked under the blow and merely reached out to strike the flying dark mage on the chest. The wind ripped and sliced through the man, leaving deep and protracted cuts, and the dark mage screamed in pain. The man was electrocuted even more by the combination of the lightning and the water than by the lightning alone. Naruto kicked the man off the ground as he fell, and the 2 flew out of the guild by smashing through the guild wall. The now flying man collided with one of the dark mages who was rushing at Kana. Naruto turned to face the sound and instantly raised the chakra level in his hands, but he couldn't see who was speaking through the smoke. "Are you kidding? These kids are the ones raising hell in our guild?" he asked. With a wild cackle, black lightning started to shoot out of his hands in sporadic arcs. The wind cooled the water to nearly freezing temperatures and formed a coating around the blonde's arm and fist, while the water swirling around his hands began to fizz when it came into contact with the lightning. But this one with the strange headband and clothing seems to have an interesting ability. Let's see how strong he is. The other mage of the A-class replied. The 2 older mages were now visible to Naruto. They both wore black gothic style clothing and stood about 6 feet tall. With his eyes fixed on the 2 A-class mages, Naruto maintained a practiced gaze while turning his head slightly to speak to his team. Naruto commanded, "Natsu, Gray, Kana. Get out of the building now," his voice overpowering the sounds of combat. Gray and Natsu both gave cheeky salutes after dodging a dark mage's kick and punch, respectively. The dark mage was then thrown through the guild wall and out of the building after both of them seized onto the overextended appendage and spun around. "See you later, Naruto," Natsu said as he charged out of the building, grabbing onto 2 other dark mages as he flew out. Gray used his ice to capture as many dark mages as he could. Then he leapt out of the building after the Dragon Slayer with the pink hair. Because she was unfamiliar with close quarters combat and had to deal with 2 B-ranked mages at once, Kana took a little longer. In a display of absurd flexibility, Kana leaned back all the way to the floor when one of them reached forward with their fist at her head, obviously missing the blow. Kana leapt over the sweeping kick by pushing off of her legs and landing on her hands when the other dark mage attempted to use a spinning kick on the floor. She then used Naruto's unpredictable nature to twist her body and spin her legs, repeatedly kicking the 2 mages in the face with a helicopter kick. After Kana had taken care of her now 2 unconscious opponents, Kana turned around and gave Naruto a thumbs up and a smile before jumping out of the building. The 3 other people in his group were too at ease with this mission. Naruto sighed. Naruto then turned his entire attention back to the two mages in front of him. Their eyebrows were raised as they gazed at Naruto. "You the leader of your little team, kid?" Naruto asked, ignoring the moniker given to him by the older of the two mages, instead focusing on the dark mages. When Naruto didn't answer, the dark mage who had asked the question grunted. Naruto would exploit the other mage's utterly conceited statement, "Whatever, we're not like those idiots that got beaten that easily. We'll take care of you without even trying." It was risky to underestimate a formidable foe. However, Naruto stayed silent and kept staring once more. As the silent blonde irritated the dark mages, they tried to agitate him. "Hey, little kid, listen to your betters. Fine, this should work. After we beat you up, we'll take care of your little friends. They seem pretty strong, they'll do well for us in the slave trade. The girl in your group is a real cutie. She'll be great at different business for real women. She'll be perfect in a few years," the younger of the two dark mages said with a filthy sneer. Naruto lowered his head a little, and his eyebrows quirked. He had heard enough of the mage's stupid banter. "It's funny. I've heard that threat so many times when I was a ninja. And ninjas are supposed to be professional and not have emotions during their missions, but every time I heard one of my precious people friend like that, I want to kill them. You two are lucky that Earthand doesn't believe in killing. I've killed for a lot less." In any case, the blonde had finally opened up to the two, but it wasn't what they had anticipated from the somewhat diminutive blonde. With his chakra levels rising to Jonin level and his face shadowed by his bangs, Naruto growled, "All of your kind is the same." His killing intent began to seep heavily from his body. When Naruto looked up, he saw that his eyes were golden, surrounded by orange pigment, and had an odd horizontal bar in the center. The two dark mages flinched for a moment as the blonde glared at them with such hatred. The growing desire to kill was undoubtedly hurting their case. The two dark mages shivered as Naruto raised his hands as his chakra levels rose to cage levels once more. "Amateurs, letting me build up my attack. They shouldn't even be A-class mages. Threatening me with the same kind of thing every time." Naruto uttered slowly, his voice growing darker as water, wind, and lightning started to whirl violently around his body. As he calmly released half of his reserves, Naruto declared, "You two aren't leaving until every single bone in your body is broken. Storm style. Heaven's wrath." The blonde's raised hand was then brought down for execution, as though to pass judgment. "The dark guild building is outside." Gray yelled, "What the hell is that?" As it grew darker and started to rain, the three teenagers gazed up at the sky. "There's a storm coming," Natsu said when he felt electricity building up in the air, but what was strange was that the storm clouds had only covered on top of the building. The sudden explosion and crash that struck the building caused the three teenagers to jump away just in time, shielding their faces with their hands. They were astounded by what they saw when they looked up once more. The three were just outside the barrier, and a wild twister surrounded the building as it closed in on the guild building. Water and lightning started to combine with the wind to create a stunning and horrifying destructive tool. The three teenagers were sent reeling backwards when the building was finally struck by the combined elements, causing another powerful explosion. In order to stop any further involuntary movement, Gray immediately formed an ice wall in front of and behind them. Kana questioned mockingly, "We can all agree that Naruto is pissed, right?" Gray and Natsu gave each other serious nods. The blonde had never used any of his more devastating attacks. Instead, he had always used seals or outwitted his opponents through superior hand-to. Hand fighting. The blonde would have been furious if Naruto had used one of his more powerful attacks, even for an S-class mission and against two A-class mages. And an enraged Naruto was never good for his opponents. When the storm subsided and vanished, Gray and his two companions dropped the walls and were instantly taken aback by the destruction. The guild building's former structure was totally destroyed, and it was totally destroyed, since the area where Naruto's attack had landed had created a charred black area that was steaming and on fire. Large pieces of metal and wood were scattered throughout the battlefield, if that was what it could be called at this point. Numerous dark mages in the vicinity were unconscious and steaming, twitching erratically. Natsu exclaimed, "That's so cool, I want to do that, Naruto, teach me," with enthusiasm. With two sagging items in each hand, the blonde was observed approaching his three teammates. Gray, Kana, and Natsu saw what it was as he approached. The pair of A-class mages appeared to have seen better days, much better days. Naruto smiled and walked past the three, signaling for them to follow him when he was directly in front of them. With a look of eagerness on his face, Natsu immediately followed Naruto after jumping at the command. Despite the dire circumstances they had been in only moments before, the blonde simply grinned and laughed at the vivacious dragonslayer. Natsu's smile briefly vanished as he assumed a contemplative expression before a megawatt smile took its place. Haha Natsu. I don't know if I can teach you the exact same move, but can't you make something similar to what I did with your Dragon Slayer magic? He asked. Natsu confidently exclaimed, hell yeah. And when I make it, it'll be 100 times better than what you did. Naruto simply chuckled and carried on following the path through the forest. They would eventually be discovered by the Rune Knights. Naruto's last attack was spectacular and big enough to attract the attention of anyone who could see it from a great distance. The two dark mages would moan as their souls seemed to come out of their mouths, but for the time being, the blonde would have fun dragging them through the forest. Kana looked intently at the two mages and asked quietly, did you have to be that harsh on them? With a fake sheepish expression on his face, Naruto glanced at the girl before turning forward once more. Naruto said, sorry, my bad. I didn't mean to, while utterly lying. As they deadpanned at the blonde, the other three team members, including Natsu, sweat dropped. You're not sorry at all, they all agreed. Skip in time, 30 minutes. A haughty Rune Knight remarked, you've got to be kidding. You're just a little kid. Go back home or to your guild. There's no way you took care of that dark guild. The four-person team was beginning to grow agitated. Natsu had already set his hands on fire, but Naruto had prevented the erratic Dragon Slayer from engaging in combat that might have led to their punishment. Naruto calmly stated, I'm telling you all that you need to know. We did our mission and we expect payment, but there was a hint of menace in his voice. And I'm telling you to go home, kid. There's no way you defeated a dark guild at your age, the Rune Knight replied. About 20 Rune Knights were present in the forest clearing, and their only goal was to transport the dark mages to the prison before they regained consciousness. However, the blonde claimed that all of their bones were broken, which allayed their fears that the mages would flee. But since the Dark Guild had two A-class mages, none of them thought the four kids had vanquished a 40-member guild. An authoritative voice asked, what are all of you maggots doing? When the Rune Knights turned to face the voice and straightened their backs, their commander glared at each and every one of them. He was a tall, heavy, armored man with a sword fastened to his waist. It was a typical Rune Knight aside from that, save for the man's air of authority. Naruto grinned and said, well, are any of you maggots going to answer? Not only did he like this guy, but he also reminded him of Ibiki. The Rune Knight who had been arguing with the blonde said in a submissive tone, sir. We were trying to take the two dark mages from his young mage here, but he insists that he and his team took care of the Dark Guild. The Rune Knight in question was irritated by Kana's unrestrained snicker, which Naruto and Natsu suppressed. Before he spoke, the group's commander turned to face Naruto and inspected the young blonde. He inquired, what is your name, young lad? But Naruto answered right away because he thought it was more of a demand than a question. There were moments for familiarity. My name is Naruto Uzumaki, sir, the blonde said with the appropriate deference. That wasn't the case here. The commander appeared to be affected by the name, as evidenced by the slight relaxation of his face and the slight raise of his eyebrows in surprise. Oh, so you're the hot-shot mage that everyone is talking about. The youngest mage ever to reach S-class, said the commander. All of the Rune Knights were taken aback by this, but the one who had been most resistant to acknowledging that Naruto and his group had taken care of the Dark Guild was particularly shocked. In reply, Naruto merely gave a curt nod. The commander hummed to himself and slowly nodded, yes, I am, sir. Then he returned his attention to the blonde. Once more, Naruto felt that this was more of an order than a question. Do you mind telling me what kind of magic you used? I have never seen that kind of magic before and it would be easier to write down the details accurately if I had all of the facts. The blonde made the decision to respond honestly. The commander nodded slowly to himself once more. It's my storm magic, sir. It's a combination of lightning, wind, and water. The commander abruptly turned to point at the Rune Knight beside Naruto as though he was making up his mind. As the commander put it, you will take the two dark mages from this young lad here. The Rune Knight grinned and nodded before turning to face Naruto. But the blonde was grinning too, sensing that the commander wasn't quite done. After turning to Naruto, the commander went on. The entire Naruto team grinned and nodded in agreement with the commander's decision when he said, and as you for in your team, you will receive your proper reward at the end of this week. We will send it to Fairy Tail. Naruto calmly said, thank you. We will take our leave now with your consent, as he casually dropped the two broken mages to the ground, causing them to groan in pain. The four-member team walked past the commander and the other Rune Knights along the forest path until they were out of sight after the commander nodded in return. The commander rubbed his chin thoughtfully as he watched the young blonde with the headband leave. The commander muttered to himself, storm magic. Now that's something I have never heard of. Perhaps I should write his moniker as Storm in my report. Arashi, Storm. That has a good ring to it, before turning back to his rune knights with a serious expression. What are you doing, you maggots? Let's get the hell out of here and return to base.
So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more awesome stories like this. Thank you. See you all in my next video.